Hello, and welcome to the Food Plus Summit 2022, Foreign Policy's flagship annual food and sustainability event. Opening the program today, we welcome Susan Sadegova, Foreign Policy's Vice President of Strategic Development, to our live stage.
Hello, good morning, and greetings to our global audience. Welcome to Foreign Policy's Food Plus Summit. We're excited to convene this summit for the fourth year in a row, and I'm delighted to open the program this morning to provide a preview of what's to come. Since launching in 2019, this program has grown to reach thousands of people and continues to garner momentum and support from partners and participants around the globe. We're pleased to provide this platform to convene these incredibly important conversations geared toward establishing a more globally sustainable and secure food system. Our program this year is taking place against the backdrop of President Biden's gathering with African leaders in Washington, D.C., where today and this week, public and private sector leaders are coming together to discuss food security and identify partnerships that will grow markets and strengthen global value chains. We look forward to hearing from our speakers about what can be done to mitigate shocks and strengthen global food systems for countries around the world. We have an incredible lineup of speakers today, including both leaders at the highest levels of government and local communities. Over the course of the next few hours, we'll hear from the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Agriculture Commissioner of the European Union, members of U.S. Congress, civil society, and nonprofits. I want to take a moment to thank our partners who have helped to make this event possible: Chemonics, Open Society Foundations, and the Walton Family Foundation. Before we get started, a few very quick housekeeping items. We have a diverse audience from across the world tune in to this event here on our virtual event platform and also on social media watching our live stream. We want to hear from you. So for those of you who are logged in through our event webpage at foreignpolicy.com/events, please remember to submit your questions via the question box to the left of the video player on your screen. We'll try to include as many audience questions as possible during our live sessions. If you're joining us on social media, please chime in on the conversation using the hashtag FBFoodPlus. Let's make sure this conversation is heard far and wide. Hope you enjoy the program, and thank you again very much for joining.
Earlier this week, Rena Ninan, veteran journalist and founder of Good Trouble Productions, sat down to speak with Ambassador Cindy McCain, the U.S. permanent representative to the UN agencies in Rome, to get her take on how the food crisis is being further exacerbated by conflict, climate, and COVID-19.
Ambassador McCain, thank you so much for joining us from Rome. I want to get right to it and ask you, what do you believe are really the greatest vulnerabilities right now to the global food systems?
Well, let me start with this. Food security itself is absolutely a national security issue. No doubt about it. And it's taken really a few years for us to relate to, and for them, quite frankly, to relate to us, but the defense arena to understand this is something that does affect national security and should be dealt with as such. I think the biggest issues, if I may start with that, are the 3 C's, we call it: COVID, climate, and conflict. And all 3 of those combined, which is really kind of the perfect storm we're in right now worldwide, has caused not only a food security issue that is not only prominent, but in many cases is causing a famine. So food security itself and food, the availability of food, the availability to be able to grow your own food, all of those issues are part of what makes up this tragic arena that we're in right now. And let me say, the conflict and the war in Ukraine, all of this could be stopped very easily if Putin would pull out of Ukraine and stop what he's doing, because, as you know, Ukraine was a breadbasket to most of Europe and parts of Asia, and we no longer have that due to the invasion and the conflict that's going on.
So, Ambassador McCain, with that thinking that, as you say, it is a national security interest for the US looking at these global food supply chains with the war raging in Ukraine, from your vantage point in Europe, what do you believe needs to be done to strengthen, as you said, that breadbasket there in Ukraine?
Well, number one, what has strengthened what's going on right now is not only the United States, but of course many other countries. But as always, the United States is number one in not only providing assistance, but also providing equipment, et cetera. And by that, I mean with regards to the food and agriculture issue. I don't speak to any of the other issues, as you know. It's very important that as the fallout has begun and grain is in limited quantity right now, it is getting out. The Black Sea grain deal is working for the moment, but remember, none of this would have happened if there hadn't been an invasion. So what we do and what I do as the U.S. ambassador to the UN agencies here is not only to make sure and continue the good work that the United States does worldwide, but to make sure that our partners understand that not only are we there, but they should be there as well. So we encourage our partners and our like-mindeds from around the world to join us in assisting particular parts of the world, not just Ukraine, but particular parts of the world that are in dire straits right now.
You mentioned the Black Sea grain deal, which we're going to get into a little bit extensively later this hour, but I want to get your sense. Do you think the continuation of this deal will likely happen after the 4-month extension that was agreed upon in November? And if that doesn't happen, if it's an absolute failure to uphold, what happens in that situation?
I think it's going to last for this reason. There is world pressure on Russia right now. And as you know, the misinformation that Russia has been putting out says that the sanctions are the cause of all this, which is simply not true. Agricultural products as well as fertilizers are not part of the sanctions. So none of that was ever part of it. If we keep the pressure on and make sure that the world keeps the pressure on with Russia, then we can continue the grain deal. But again, the only way out of this is for Putin to stop this war and pull out.
And if that doesn't happen, the sense that Putin continues on without limits, how do you believe we can best strengthen international partnerships? Do you believe that solidarity will continue in the new year?
I do. I think we've seen a world flabbergasted by what he has done to a nation that was independent. And also, I think what he said, he's basically flagrantly flagged all this and rubbed it in the faces of many people around the world. We're talking about life issues here. It's about food security. It's about the ability to be able to be independent. And I'm talking about African nations and Asian nations and be independent on their own, to be able to grow their own food. It's completely stopped a lot of this. And so what our role as the United States has in this is to not only help other nations, as well as the ones that are right in the middle of this, but other nations, help them grow their own food and become independent. Now you say, how do you do that if there's a drought, or how do you do that? Well, by providing science and technology, equipment that can help find water and also use less water to grow crops and grow others, and for cattle, et cetera, those kinds of things. It's a combined effort, and the world, I think, has seen this for what it is a flagrant invasion, and have come to the table quite handily. But of course, we would love for them to do more in all of this.
We started this conversation and you said it's really about the 3 C's: COVID, climate, and conflict. We've talked a little bit about conflict. I'd love to move on to climate. You were recently on a trip to Cambodia where you met with local organizations to discuss things like food and water security, climate change, even sustainable fisheries.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about that trip, because I know so much is focused on Ukraine, but what else are you?
Cambodia is an incredible country. Their issue with climate has been too much water. They've been inundated with floods. which, as you know, tears the land up, tears agricultural fields up, crop fields for grazing, etc. Completely tears it apart, and they have to start over. So part of the things that we're doing there to encourage and to help encourage other countries to do is, for instance, the World Food Program feeding program in the schools that takes place. A lot of kids in troubled areas, not troubled areas, but areas like that, like the ones that have occurred in Cambodia and Laos and others, is because of the climate change. And so perhaps the only meal they get is the one they get in school. And they are part of the climate change, but also the ability to grow your own. Is now schools are adopting programs where they can have their own gardens, so they can either keep and eat what they grow or sell what they grow and put it back into the schools for various other reasons. This program at WFP is a very unique program, and it's very successful, and it's used worldwide.
Can you tell us a little bit about some of the work that's been done on the ground there, focusing on climate smart agriculture? Any takeaways from your trip that might give you hope about the future of food security and combating hunger worldwide?
Well, there's some great programs that deal specifically with climate smart agriculture, and primarily run by women, which is to me is the absolute ultimate in all of this. Because women are the people that actually are hurt the most. Women and children are hurt the most by what goes on. So the climate smart agriculture that's being utilized and taught and initiated by the Food and Agriculture Organization, as well as WFP and some other countries, help not only women in particular learn how to do this, but helps them enable themselves as a village and as a community. And of course, it's good. It's good for what they do with less water, more food, all the techniques that depending on the region that are necessary to be able to help communities help themselves.
So we've talked a little bit about the influence on our food systems from from climate and from conflict. How do you think COVID has impacted what we're seeing now? And do you have hope that things can be rebuilt and picked back up from what we lost under COVID?
Well, obviously, it was devastating all over the world. We saw the impact of it, not just from the obvious impact, which is the disease itself, but the fallout that occurred with regard to supply chains, transportation costs, other things, not just from what's going on in Ukraine, but in general. The world shut down, and many countries in some cases actually stopped what they were doing before because they didn't have the tools to do it, and others it limited what they could do. We're moving back in a direction now with the help of so many other countries, and also these organizations that the UN that function within the UN system to build back what they had and to build back what could be and for the future. And most of all, training our young people to be farmers and to look at agriculture as a possible vocation, which is most important because so many of these kids, if they get an opportunity to get out of the village, they're gone. And so we want, part of what we do is to try to encourage and train and support young people as well as women in the arena of agriculture.
When you look at geopolitics and the impacts it has on the global food systems, I know there's so much reason for concern and fear, but is there anything that gives you hope that you're watching and seeing that could, in this moment of crisis, be an opportunity?
Yeah. Well, I think I may be. I'm kind of one of those people that in the worst situations I can find a little ray of sunshine or a little hope someplace. And I think the willpower of women around the world to make the world a better place is probably the most consuming and the most impactful issue that can possibly help the world. uh, people in general are tired of conflict for the most part, and are tired of just asking for a handout. We say not a handout, a hand up. And so that's why these programs, and that's why the United States and USAID, in particular, are so good at what they do, because they empower other people in other countries to help themselves. And that therein lies, instead of giving them seeds, of course we do that, but instead of giving them just seeds, we give them a life, and we give them an opportunity to help themselves and train them. So many of these people I've run across now started as school kids, learning about seeds, learning about growing things, learning all those tools, and are now working on climate and progressing not only within their own villages, but around their own countries to try to help the situation as it is. It's all very, to me, there's always a ray of sunshine someplace. We can find it. And we just have to remember to keep encouraging it and keep at it.
I love that message. And speaking of keep at it, it's so great to see you serving your country in office. You've served for decades alongside your husband, the late Senator McCain. I believe political spouses are so influential in politics, but it's great to see you have a formal title. How is it going? And have there been any surprises since you've taken office?
It's going great. I mean, I can't believe I'm in this situation and doing what I'm doing and representing my country in this way. I just never thought that would ever be in my future. It's going great. I mean, it's going great in that this particular office is one that can really affect change. And so the opportunity to not only work on these issues, but see the impact of them as well is just, for me, is just life changing. And I think also it's important to remember that the United States, in many cases, is the beacon that other countries look to, not only for hope, but for the ability to help themselves. And so I love seeing this. I love being a part of it. It's what I've been doing all of my life, but now I can do it on behalf of my country, and I'm so grateful for that.
Ambassador Cindy McCain, so grateful you could join us for this conversation.
Thank you.
Next, Rena Ninen will join us on the live stage. She is joined by Tetiana Dudka, the Senior Vice President of Europe and Eurasia at Chemonics, Dr. Robert Bertram, Chief Scientist at USAID's Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, and Caitlin Welsh, the Director of the Global Food Security Program at CSIS, to discuss strategies for strengthening global supply chains.
Thank you so much for joining us as we're going to take a deeper look on how to strengthen global supply chains amidst the shockwaves that have hit the global supply chain commodities market. Caitlin, I'd love to you because you've spent some time actually testifying on Capitol Hill about the disruptions that we've seen. I know my conversation with Ambassador McCain, we talked a little briefly about the Black Sea grain deal. I was wondering if you could give us just a 60-second update on this initiative that was reached in July and if you believe it's working and will continue.
Thanks. That's a very important question, and I want to say thanks for having me, and I'm very happy to be here with my colleagues. Black Sea Grain Initiative was signed in July, and I often hear the question, is it working? It's working according to the goals that were set out, which are to relieve some pressure by getting some exports out of Ukraine. Now, what it's not doing, it's not returning Ukraine to its pre-war export levels. As of right now, it's averaging about 3 million metric tons of exports per month compared to about 5 million metric tons in 2021. So working according to the goals that were set out, but not according to, but not returning Ukraine to its pre-war export levels.
I want to turn, Tatiana, to you as well, because not only are you a practitioner in this field, you're Ukrainian, you have crews on the ground, you have a special connection there. When we're looking at the vulnerabilities in the agriculture sector with this hot war going on in Ukraine, what are you seeing and what are you most concerned about?
Thank you, Rena, and it's an honor to be talking about this. We have about 300-person crew on the ground working on supporting Ukraine and Ukrainians to address immediate needs and recover from the war. In 2021, Ukraine was the third largest exporter of corn and barley and the fifth largest exporter of wheat. That is more than 8% of global exports of wheat and near 12% of corn. And as Caitlin is saying, it's not possible at the moment to go back to the pre-war export levels. There are a number of countries in the world that were largest buyers of Ukrainian grain, including Egypt, which was one of the largest buyers, and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Libya and others, many countries in Asia, Africa, and Europe. And the war is not just impacting Ukraine, but also the whole world. Russia is deliberately targeting critical infrastructure and transportation system. And with the blockage of the seaports is creating this crisis in the food system globally. Ukraine is, in addition to effective participation in the grain program, tries to diversify its export and transportation and logistics chains, and started to export through rail and through roads, through the Western ports, which takes, of course, longer and is more expensive. So I think when we talk about the global vulnerabilities of the supply chains and of the agricultural sectors in all of the countries in the world, we are looking at how we can work on sovereignty of those countries, not just their resilience, and redefine agricultural sectors to ensure that the local production is adding to significant imports that many countries in the world had. The damages to Ukrainian ag sector because of the war are estimated to be about a quarter of the total assets that Ukraine had, more than 6.5 billion. And the trade routes and export logistics continue to present a challenge. Through the grain deal, more than 500 ships have already left the seaports of Ukraine, which is not enough. I think it puts Ukraine back at about 64% of last year's exports. As you mentioned, I'm Ukrainian myself, and what is happening in Ukraine is impacting me personally. There are power outages in Ukraine. Many businesses and all population are redefining how they are functioning. For example, my dad in Kyiv, they have power only for a few hours at night to decrease the pressure on the whole infrastructure in the system. However, Ukraine is installing generators at the grain terminals to ensure that exports continue and that food reaches people in need. I was in Ukraine 4 weeks ago, and what I have seen there is just an admirable example of courage, commitment, and resilience, especially coming from the Ukrainian farmers that became that token of freedom and resilience to many countries in the world. Even as missiles fall from the sky, through electricity supply interruptions, through air alarms, they are harvesting, drying, planning for the next season, and with critical supplies that the US government is providing through the Agri Initiative. The farmers are also learning to use new technologies and new machinery to better post-harvest handling and storing, because one of the critical needs is not just support the export of what exists, but plan for the midterm and longer term future, and ensure that we are looking at how we are saving the next season and then the season after that.
Mm-hmm. I know it's so deeply personal. It's not just policy, but you have such a personal connection, and it's fascinating to hear that as well. Dr. Bertram, I know you focus in your center at USA looking at resilience and food security. When you look at the shock waves that have hit, we know countries are looking for new ways to diversify oil, grain, fertilizer suppliers. What do you believe is the potential for diversifying those suppliers and trying to increase resilience? What needs to be done?
Well, thank you, Rena. It's a pleasure to join you today. Just before we leave Ukraine, I would like to add that even with all the efforts that are being made, we're looking at 30% reduction in the wheat planting for this season coming up. So we're not out of the woods yet. And as you say, the impact of these price shocks are greatest in low-income countries, which are, of course, areas where there's already major food security challenges, having been really exacerbated by COVID first, and then by the following price shocks in energy and fertilizer. So we're facing a very challenging situations, and we see countries having to spend a great deal of money to try to keep prices affordable. But as we go into another year of high prices, even though they've come down some, they're still historically high. Countries are facing fiscal challenges because they have a big hangover of debt from trying to mitigate these price impacts in the last year. The other thing we see is the food supply issues. We have the challenges from the war, and particularly affecting Ukraine, but also some other countries. And then we have drought in Argentina associated with La Nina. So that's going to continue to constrain prices. So some other very important work that's come to light just recently from the International Food Policy Research Institute is that even a 5% increase in food prices can drive up to 9% increase in child wasting, acute malnutrition, severe malnutrition. And this is, of course, we're looking at many countries that have had way more than 5%. And of course, this hits hardest on the poor. So as you say, there's a couple of issues here. One is to diversify, especially through trying to develop regional and local sources of trade that enable more buffering and a little less exposure to foreign markets. And we are very active in that in USAID by trying to help build the capacity of countries to rapidly enable their farming communities to respond. Last point on this, though, is that despite many bright spots of progress in reaching really millions of farmers, as we anticipate in the coming year, in Africa, which is the most vulnerable region globally, we still see fertilizer use down 24% as a result of the high prices, lessening demand, and farmers just using less. So it's not a good situation looking forward, and building resilience both within affected countries, but also making sure global supply chains function. And thankfully, the export restrictions that were put in place 8 months ago have really come down to much less than they were.
Dr. Bertram, it's fascinating to hear you say a 20% reduction in fertilizer use in Africa. That's really devastating to hear. Caitlin, one of the big focuses is sort of looking at the power that Russia wields through food exports. How do you exactly reduce their influence and protect the food supply?
That's a great question, and I just want to say the answer isn't easy. We're dealing with a problem that we haven't had to deal with in probably ever, where on the one hand we're trying to balance our development goals with also our political goals to reduce Russia's power on the global stage. It is the fact that Russia it does wield considerable influence through its very powerful agriculture sector. It became a net food exporter this century and the world's largest exporter of wheat in 2017, and has remained the top exporter since then. Because of that, helps to curry favor, at least to quell dissent among the countries that rely on Russia for its imports. And it's not just wheat, but it's also many other grains and inexpensive forms of all types of fertilizers. So it's very important to maintain Russia's exports on global markets because of the volume of exports that they have, again, in grains and also in fertilizers. Small fluctuations in exports from Russia have great impacts on global supplies and global prices. On the other hand, Russia, of course, it's very aware of the influence that it wields through its agriculture sector. It has stated publicly that food is its secret weapon. This was stated by a former Russian president earlier this spring. Russia, of course, a primary aim in this goal is to fully destroy Ukraine's agriculture sector. Of course, that hasn't been achieved, but it's wielded system-wide attacks across Ukraine's agriculture sector. It has stolen grains from Ukraine and sold them as its own. It's using its participation in the Black Sea Grain Initiative to get leverage in the war. We saw that it exited the initiative and then returned to the initiative at the end of October for political reasons. As Ambassador McCain mentioned, it's perpetrating a false narrative about the reasons for global food insecurity that we're experiencing in the midst of this war, blaming it on Western countries for the sanctions that are being imposed on Russia and on Belarus. So I think that the answer isn't clear right now. I've been very pleased to see importance placed on maintaining export levels from Russia by carving out exemptions in exports to allow Russia's food and fertilizer exports to continue to flow. At the same time, though, I think it's a very vexing problem and a very complicated problem to have to figure out how to approach this issue of how do we reduce the influence that Russia is getting through its agriculture exports.
All right. I want to remind everyone we are going to be taking questions shortly, and feel free to submit them through the Q&A button there, and let us know your name, the agency you're with, and your question as well, and we'll be taking some of those shortly. Tatiana, I want to turn to you and ask you, I know Dr. Bertram mentioned how planting in Africa is down 20%, but we know planting in Ukraine, because of this war, is also down significantly. What do you believe are the partnerships in both the private and public sector that you see on the ground that are working?
Thank you. That's a great question. And yes, in Ukraine, since the war started, about 25% of agricultural land was not accessible due to occupation, and about half of that was recently liberated. But a lot of the land cannot be used because of high level of contamination, from the military equipment, from the landmines and unexploded ordinances. So there is a significant challenge in going into the next season, and this is where the partnerships are really essential. We need to have partnerships with donors and co-funders. We need to have partnerships with the financial institutions. We need to have partnerships with the private sector, with the technology companies, because a lot of these solutions, right, rely on innovation and not just on trying to start production of fertilizers and like things that countries were trying to do, in the past and continue to try to do, but switch into more modern technologies that decrease the waste and spoilage, that support climate resilience, that build modern infrastructure that allows for cheaper production. One of the partnerships we had in Ukraine is with the drone UA company, and this is where we worked with more than 90 farmers to use spraying services through drones. And it's a great example of the new use and innovative use of the technology that was created for other purposes. But with spraying with drones of grain crops, of berries, of fruits in several parts of Ukraine, we're seeing significant decrease in use of pesticides, most importantly, getting to the hard to reach places. The drones don't tread plants, which saves about 10% of the harvest. So that's just one of examples of, high technology application that many countries have to be adopting. We also see a lot of financial institution partnerships that are emerging because agricultural sector in many countries is not very attractive because, right, the lack of substantial collateral, high interest rates prevents a lot of farmers from expanding and investing in infrastructure. And it will continue to be really critical because we see less demand for non-essential products among country populations, given the high prices. So investments into new infrastructure, investments into inputs for the new planting season will be significant. What we did in Ukraine, we looked at why access to state and bank funding is limited. And one of the reasons was that the farmers didn't know how to submit their application packages. And since you can only apply once to a government program in Ukraine, like if they submitted an incomplete package, they were out of the running for the government funding with reduced interest rates. So we partnered with a local company called AgriAnalytica to design a digital fintech app for agricultural producers that essentially helps any interested agricultural enterprise to collect their application documents and make sure that the package is complete and final, which eases this access to finance. So finding innovative ways to bring other sectors into the agricultural sector to ease access to funding and investment. Other types of partnerships, we are partnering with seed manufacturers to bring high yield, more modern seed varieties to the farmers. Another great example is from Lebanon, where USAID helped to cost share investments for local alfalfa production. So investments into switching from your traditional products and services into the new one to offset some of the costs. There, the example was to start the cattle and goat feed production because the prices went up by 3,000% since the Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and with one of the highest consumption rates for dairy in the world, like this increase was unsustainable for Lebanon and Lebanon farmers. So they had to completely rethink the approach to imports and build those partnerships to invest in new technologies and new forms of production.
Tatiana, thank you so much for that perspective on financing and also the partnerships that can come with technology as well. Dr. Bertrand, I want to turn to you, and we've got a question here about crop cycles. I was wondering if you could answer. It's from Jonathan Schreier from DC, from the US State Department, and he's asking, the annual or semi-annual duration of crop cycles makes it hard for food systems to adapt swiftly to mass shocks like the loss, hopefully temporary, of Ukrainian grain and oil seeds. What do you believe or recommend can be done to produce immediate effects in the coming weeks and months on the global supply gap?
So let's start with that, Rena, by focusing on the areas of greatest vulnerability. And we can actually see those countries where there's been the highest price increases and the greatest impacts on low-income consumers with really serious effects. So the White House announced during the UN General Assembly in September something called the Accelerated Innovation Delivery Initiative. And this is a $140 million initiative that is basically doing something we haven't done before. And it's to respond to exactly the points Jonathan is saying. It is to help position all kinds of groups working with farmers, and we can call these the last mile partners. This could be the local private sector, it could be farmer cooperatives, it could be groups like 1 Acre Fund or Catholic Relief Services, World Vision, and many others. And what we're doing in that initiative is we're putting those groups directly in touch with the generators of these things like Tatiana talked about, climate smart seeds, better soil fertility management, and fertilizer use efficiency. And we're actually doing this based on cropping seasons, as Jonathan suggests. So in some parts of Africa that are most affected, there are 2 cropping seasons. And we are going full bore in those areas to make the season that's starting in February. In other parts of Southern Africa in particular, it's now, starting last month. And we are similarly working there across Zambia, Malawi, Tanzania, with a $50 million initiative aimed at accelerating the availability of not only the technologies and better practices, but better advisory services and things around prices, weather, disease and pest management, and capacity building. And in some cases, targeted finance to help jumpstart a system that's really been reeling from other shocks, as we mentioned earlier, over the last couple of years. The other piece that's very critical to addressing what Jonathan is talking about is the price of fertilizer. And it's very high. It's come down some, which is good, but it still remains very high. And in Africa in particular, the transport prices are such that it's 60% more expensive in Uganda, for example, than in the port in Mombasa in Kenya. So we're working there with industry, with partner countries to try to increase availability, and that can be through financing. Many other partners are involved with this, the African Development Bank, the World Bank, the private sector itself. Then we're working on accessibility, and this is in particular to make sure that the fertilizer reaches these low-income, vulnerable communities. If it's left to the market alone, it can sometimes just get sucked up by the more developed, larger farm sector. So we want to try to have an equitable access here. And then very importantly, some really exciting new approaches to greatly increase the efficiency of fertilizer use. So by using a bit less even, because you can afford less, you can still get a greater impact and have much less waste. So we're really trying to affect that whole food system, but in a way that is very much driven by the opportunities, the planting seasons, and then finally that trade issue again, to make sure that that food can move, that markets are functioning efficiently. We're trying to reduce waste. And last point is, all of this I'm talking about fits exactly what Ambassador McCain talked about in terms of climate smart agricultural practices that support a resilient food system.
Bertrand, thank you so much. It's also interesting, there's so much conversation about increasing ports throughout Europe, but you highlighting Africa is very important and crucial as well is such a great point. Caitlin, we've only got a few minutes left, but I've got a question from Nicole DePaula in Rome from FAO saying, how do we leverage political leadership to invest in long-term food systems transformation, especially considering the current geopolitical and climate crisis? What key actors should be further engaged?
That's a great question. I think what we can do is build on the political attention that global food security and nutrition are receiving right now. Those of us who work on this issue have experienced crises so far this century, but really this is the biggest crisis in global food security and nutrition that we've experienced thus far. And I've been very pleased to see the attention that it's getting in the G7, in the G20, at the UN, and in particular by the U.S. government nationally, and seeing the United States lead in these fora. I'm pleased to see this attention, and I think it's incredibly important to maintain this, not just for the duration of this crisis, but for the long term. This year, the UN predicted that that given global trends, the number of people experiencing undernutrition in 2030, they projected to 2030, would be the same as in 2015 when the Sustainable Development Goals were launched, meaning that essentially no progress would be made. In order to move the needle in the right direction, we need attention, again, not just for the duration of this crisis, but for the longer term, to address the immediate impacts of the crisis and all the things that we've been talking about so far in this conversation, helping Ukraine to rebuild its agriculture sector, increase its own exports, getting assistance to those who are most vulnerable right now, but also longer term questions about diversifying agriculture production toward more nutritious foods, to help people access not just food but more nutritious diets, making agriculture more climate smart. Many more long-term questions we need to address, which we can address through long-term attention, so that this is not just on agendas while crises happen, but again in the long term.
Caitlin, thank you so much. Tatiana, we've got literally 2 minutes left. And Tatiana, I want to give you the final word. As we're looking to sort of create this new world order in agriculture, Ukraine is really a big testing ground at this moment. What are you watching for that you think could be pivotal? And I want to end on a little bit of hope, because I know there's a lot of depressing things, but what gives you the most hope as someone on the ground watching the situation in Ukraine?
I think, we have a lot, to be hopeful for, and we have a lot of reasons to be really hopeful. And as you said, we are using Ukraine with its, high level of education at all levels in all sectors, with high level of technology use, as a testing ground for new, simpler, cheaper, more effective solutions that then can be transferred to other parts of the world, to Asia, to Africa, where there is the greatest need. We are looking at how production is being pivoted and how the farmers and agricultural enterprises are expanding what they do, how they are starting to use more domestic inputs and growing their own instead of relying on inputs from abroad. We're looking at the transportation and logistics and different solutions to, again, shorten it by creating products closer to the transportation hubs. We are looking at the storage with the hope that, we are investing a lot this year into the temporary and mobile storage, that in the years to come, the needs will change and we'll be investing more into permanent solutions. We are investing in the technologies, and as we are seeing with internet usage, right, it's very easy to join later in the game because all major investments have happened in the past, and a lot of countries are capitalizing on those more recent and modern technologies that are becoming cheaper for the whole world. So we want to see that in the agriculture. We want to invest in a lot of pilots that are scalable, not only within Ukraine, but also for in other countries in the whole world too.
Tatiana, I want to thank you. I want to thank Caitlin, and I want to thank Dr. Bertram. It's a fascinating conversation. The work that all of you are doing in this sector to create awareness, but also strengthen our global food supply systems and create this new ecosystem. It's been remarkable to me to watch how people have pivoted and how the international community has come together in a crisis we did not see 2 years ago. And it's been really impactful to hear from all of you today. There's so much hope and so much possibility, I think, just based on how people have moved so quickly. I'm also excited for this next conversation that's going to happen. I know Caitlin gave us a little view on some of the stuff happening on Capitol Hill. She's testified on Capitol Hill, but we're going to look at the view from the halls of the United States Congress. So we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank all of you for your time and your great effort and your work on this subject matter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, Allison Carlson, the Managing Director of FP Analytics, will be joined by the Chairman and Ranking Member of the Livestock and Foreign Agriculture Subcommittee, Congressman Jim Costa from California, and Congressman Dusty Johnson from South Dakota.
Good morning, Congressman. Welcome, and thank you both for taking the time this morning. We know it's a very busy week.
Thanks for having us.
Good to be here.
We're welcoming you today amid the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. And against this backdrop, yesterday we saw Secretary Blinken, U.S. Trade Representative Tai, and Samantha Power, among others, really address issues of national security. And Congressman Costa, I'd like to turn first to you. As we think about food security, I know you've spoken in past about this nexus between national security and food security. Can you talk a little bit about your priorities for your committee and how the Farm Bill and in particular Title III are addressing both?
And thank you very much for allowing myself and my friend Dusty Johnson to participate in this panel this morning. I think the Food Policy Summit and the efforts that you're engaged in is truly critical today and tomorrow in terms of food security that we are all dealing with, not only in the United States, but around the world. I always say that food is a national security issue. And too often, I think in the United States, we tend to take that for granted. But we have hunger and undernourished people in America, in the richest country in the world, sadly. But as we look around the challenges we face, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, climate change, other short-term and long-term issues that involve supply chain challenges post-pandemic. I think people are beginning to realize, I hope, that food is a national security issue. It's an international security issue and therefore should not be taken for granted. And as we prepare next year, Dusty and I and our colleagues, to reauthorize the Farm Bill, an exercise we do every 4 years, it's important that we try to do it in coordination with our European allies and others around the world. And as the chairman of the Subcommittee on Livestock and Foreign Agriculture, I hope that in the next Congress, the new leadership will continue with that focus in mind, and I will do everything I can to work together in a bipartisan effort to that end. Let me just simply say in closing that the efforts that you're engaged in here, I think we see extreme drought conditions taking place around the world, certainly in the West. Western states that have impacted our agricultural productivity. California is the #1 agriculture in the state, but we've been severely impacted over the last 2 years. And I believe because of climate change issues and other factors that water that is absolutely essential to grow the food in the next 10 years will rival energy as to whether or not nation states can live together amicably. We have a lot of more recent examples of that with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the concern about Ukraine's ability to move grains to Africa and other parts of the world. Thankfully, we were able to reach an agreement between the UN and Turkey and to Russia to move 18 million metric tons of grain to where it was needed to avoid famine and hunger. But USDA and USAID and other international organizations have worked very hard to try to prevent famine from occurring in areas where the critical need is the greatest. And so we need to figure out how in the next Farm Bill and how with our trade agreements, the ability to whether or not we rejoin the trade promotional, trade Pacific partnership is possible. But I think we have to look at all of the above. And I look forward to working with Dusty to that end. And I'll be happy to answer any questions at this time.
Great, thank you so much for that. And you raised such an important point about bipartisanship. And the two of you provide an incredible example of ways to work together and work across the aisle. And Congressman Johnson, I'd like to turn it over to you. And when you're thinking about these issues that are so important and so vital to our international relationships, to food security around the world, what are some of the concrete ways that you two are working together, specifically within your committee, and mechanisms that are supporting humanitarian assistance to address this food security crisis that the world is facing right now?
Sure. Well, two come right to mind as we look forward to the Farm Bill. The first would be MAP and FMD. We know that food security is national security. And during times of shortage or supply chain disruption, sometimes the inclination is for people to want to be more insular, more isolated, to think about just serving themselves with supplies they have on their own borders. That is, I think we all know, a mistake. The reality is that trade can strengthen strengthen supply chains. It can make more resilient our food security. And the beautiful thing about MAP and FMD is that they really provide America an even greater opportunity to help feed the world and build those stronger relationships that benefit us as well. We get a $20 return for every dollar that we invest in the MAP and the FMD programs. I think you're going to continue to see a strong bipartisan basis for that. You also mentioned humanitarian aid. So much is made of China's Belt and Road Initiative, an investment in infrastructure, and an understanding that that is a way for China to expand its soft power and its influence across the world. What sometimes people forget is the extent to which America has used that soft power of food to be able to help keep the world stable, to be able to keep millions of people alive, and to be able to expand American soft power and expand American values. Humanitarian aid through the Farm Bill, these Food for Peace programs can be an incredibly powerful bipartisan message to the world that America is the breadbasket, and we are willing to use that staggeringly powerful ability to create calories to help the world be safer and more secure.
Great, thank you.
I agree with my colleague Moore.
Wonderful. And for those who may not be familiar in our global audience, MAP being the Market Access Program and the Foreign Market Development Program that you referenced as well. And Congressman Johnson, you talked about global supply chains and certainly strengthening global trade and identifying ways to work with allies to really diversify and strengthen and make more resilient those global supply chains is really front of mind for so many right now. I'm wondering if I'm going to turn it over to you, Congressman Costa, to talk a little bit more about the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. I know that is a piece of legislation that in particular is addressing some of those supply chain issues. Can you talk a little bit more about how that legislation and that effort will strengthen global supply chains and what your priorities are to strengthen that going forward?
Well, this is another example, I believe, of bipartisan effort. Both Congressman Johnson and myself, with the Ag Committee and working with Congressman John Garamendi, made modifications this year for the Federal Maritime Commission to deal with the backlog on U.S. ports and harbors that were resulting in ships offloading product here and going back to their ports empty. And we really felt that that was unfair and discriminatory, and the demurrage issues were problematic. The Federal Maritime Commission now, we believe, has some additional tools, and the rulemaking process is ongoing to try to strive a balance. And the empty container issue, I might add, has gotten a bit better since the early months of this year. But beyond that, there's another bipartisan piece of legislation that deals with our supply chain issues that I think are critical. The bipartisan infrastructure package, $1.2 trillion, of which $19 billion has been set aside to modernize American ports to allow our shipping capacity to be on the same level of many of our trading partners, whether they be in Europe or Asia or elsewhere. Clearly, agricultural food products that we export in California, 44% of our agriculture is exported, again, the #1 agricultural state in the nation. But we need to make sure that we have the reliability to get our products in America, wherever they come from, to their destination. And so having a modernized ports and harbors to match our trading partners is absolutely essential to move food products and in places where it's most needed and where we have partners in which there has been a level of economic activity that has been improved and improves the economy of the countries that are involved in that trade. So we need to continue to work on that and improve it.
And when you talk about allies and partnerships, Congressman Johnson, I'd like it to turn it back to you for this. How can we work more effectively and in a more coordinated fashion with our allies to really strengthen those partnerships focused on food security?
I think we need to continue to advance the principles of free trade. You know, throughout the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, it was a period of remarkable progress for free trade, as people realized mercantilism and protectionism was not really the way to raise prosperity for any countries. I mean, the beautiful thing about trade is it's willing buyer, willing seller. In that instance, both parties are better off with that trade. And we have frankly, in the last 10 or 20 years, we have begun to see a little rescission of that global march of free trade. But we still know it's an incredibly powerful way to move forward economies and to move forward businesses and families. And so part of it is just making, I mean, Jim brought up the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I think there are a lot of tragedies about the American withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. the whole idea of that coalition was to push back against Chinese hegemony in the Asian region. And I think it's too bad that American leadership faltered at the 1 or 3 yard line there. It's difficult to really see a path forward for us to get back into what has been the successor organization to that. But we need to continue to say the right things and do the right things in working with our partners to try to remove tariffs as well as non-tariff barriers, because they do not serve the best interest of the global community or, frankly, any individual country.
So I'd like to pick up on that. And unfortunately, our time is running short. But thinking about alliances, partnerships, international trade. So yesterday, EU negotiators struck a preliminary deal on the carbon border adjustment tax, And negotiations are ongoing, and there'll be further conversations this weekend. But Congressman Costa, I'm wondering how you think about that type of policymaking and those types of moves that are really working to address climate change, but also affecting trade. And when we think about fertilizer, for example, being a covered industry as part of that program, what impacts could that have? And how are you thinking about that type of policymaking going forward as it pertains to impact on agriculture?
Yesterday's actions were a step in the right direction. And then when we just had a transatlantic parliamentary legislators dialogue last week with members of the European Union. And this issue of carbon challenges that we both face is something that I believe we can work on together. I think the fact that we see an ability to work together with our European allies, and I tell them, and it's not always popular, but that food, agriculture has got to be on the table as we discuss future trade agreements. I think it's essential both for our European allies and ourselves as we try to work together in dealing with China and dealing with other challenges that we face. Certainly, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has taught us that the impacts of weaponizing fertilizer and other products that are essential to agricultural production reminds us that we need to look at securing our ability to produce food, which we know is an international and national security issue, and ensure that the inputs that are necessary to produce that food are reliable. And clearly, we see the brave farmers in Ukraine trying to continue to produce food in a war zone, and it makes you understand how critical and how vulnerable our food supply truly is. So we need to work on all of these issues with our allies to create greater reliability in our food production to ensure our national and international security, so that we deal with this pending challenges on world food supply.
Very well put. Thank you. And unfortunately, we're out of time, but I would really like to thank you both for being with us today and for your work and your bipartisanship and your efforts related to food security. Thank you again. We really appreciate you being here.
Keep up the good work.
Likewise.
Now joining us on the live stage, Andrew Solinger, Foreign Policy CEO and publisher, will be joined by the former president of Costa Rica and current Fletcher Graduate School professor, Carlos Alvarado Quesada.
President Alvarado, so nice to see you, and welcome to Foreign Policy's Food Plus Summit.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here in this such important topic as talking about food security and the future of food for humanity.
Wonderful. And so you just finished your 4-year term as president of Costa Rica in May. And of course, your service was constitutionally limited, so you needed to find a new career. And now you are in Boston, as we can all see from the sweater that you're wearing, in a different climate as a professor of practice and diplomacy at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. You're also chair and founder of the Institute for Climate and Democracy and Inclusion, the CDI Institute. How is post-political life treating you? How is academia?
Well, it's wonderful. I mean, actually, it's a huge change of pace, but also I've been finding the time to reflect more on many topics. One of this being agriculture and the challenges of decarbonization and food security. And well, the change of pace is good. Actually, having the chance to reflect on many of the things that I used to work a lot, it's a very fulfilling.
Great, and you are looking very professorial in that sweater, by the way, so well done. Before we begin, I want to remind, you're welcome, I want to remind our viewers, our participants, please ask questions. President Alvarado spoke at our climate summit earlier this year. He's a very good question answer Q&A person, so please do use the button just to the lower left of the player on your screen, or email us at events@foreignpolicy.com. So, President Alvarado, we've been talking about the 3 Cs, COVID, climate, and conflict, and focused in our past few discussions primarily on the Ukraine, the Black Sea grain deal, the conflict piece. Latin America doesn't really get the same amount of focus as the Ukraine war and the impacted regions, Africa, Asia, when we discuss food security. But there are food security issues in Latin America. The recent State of Food Security report from FAO-IFAD details that Latin America has 56 million hungry, or about 8.6% of the population. That's much lower than other regions, but obviously the population is much lower. The irony is that Latin America is a huge net food exporter. It's the largest net food exporting region in the world. And Costa Rica, in particular, is a net exporter as well of delicious coffee and bananas. Yet still, insecurity there is rising due more to inflation and economic issues. But it is said that Latin America produces 400 million food for 400 million people, but it seems that not a lot of them live there. How can this be?
Well, Andrew, I think it's a great framing, the one you're doing, and also let's for a moment not only think about Latin America. If as allies and teams, the Western Hemisphere, it's geographically a team. Whatever happens in Latin America, it's linked with North America. And as Latin America is one of the net or the largest net exporter, its potential to the future to impact food security, it's key. So whatever happens in Latin America in terms of food production and export is going to have an impact in the rest of the world. So that's why food security in Latin America, it's relevant for the world as a whole, and also for North America and for the United States. And I will also want to talk a little bit on that. Inequality has a lot to do with the fact that we are producing and we are exporting, but there's not a redistribution, not in the agricultural sector or in the other sectors. So that's affecting and making our population more vulnerable. So it's in the interest of all of us to create more equal societies, economically speaking, and in rights also, so we can mitigate that problem that we're having. It's very linked to inequality. But going back as playing as a team, if you think about what's ongoing in the currently with the Ukraine war, but also thinking of long term, I think we should start seeing the whole Western Hemisphere as a team. And I think we're not doing that. If you look about the discussion, Latin America is very absent, not only on what's going on in the region, but in the context of the whole world. And there are two pieces of information I think are valuable. One, as we said, Latin America is one of the great players when it comes to food exports. It provides the world. I mean, Brazil is huge on this, Argentina is huge, Mexico is huge, but also, for example, a small country as Costa Rica has a great share of exports in pineapples or banana or many other relevant products. But two, many of these large countries in Latin America are also big oil exporters. And if we're talking about a world that's moving into phasing out oil and gas, we need to find new niches for those exports. If Latin America doesn't find those new niches to replace our exports in oil, our societies are going to be hit hard because of this. But there's a great opportunity in agriculture, and it's what's linked with that. And also, it's a great opportunity to do this green transformation in a sustainable manner. I don't see an antagonism between developing a sustainable, a green agriculture that drives food security and also making it in a sustainable way, in a way that we lower the emissions produced by agriculture. So I think this is one of the great topics, but sometimes we don't discuss this a lot. And this is one of the key topics for development of our region.
Very good points that you make, especially on fossil fuels and replacing that export driver in Latin America. You bring up climate and green technologies and green agriculture. Let's talk more about climate challenges in agriculture in Latin America. Central America is being hit hard in particular, and hurricanes and the like, havoc in floods, small farming in the Caribbean. Droughts have devastated South America's soy and wheat crops, and worsened in the dry corridor. We are at below average rainfall in key agriculture producing states such as Chile and Brazil and Uruguay, Paraguay. And a mega drought in Chile, in fact, has been in the 13th year now, longest drought in the region for 1,000 years. And the Parana-La Plata River Basin, which runs along Brazil and Paraguay and Argentina, is in its worst drought. It's even hard to ship soybean and corn into food markets down there. And that is, 80% of cereal export in Latin America heads through those regions. Haven't even talked about deforestation in Brazil. Let's talk a little bit about those challenges and how that is impacting agriculture and food production and insecurity as well, if you could.
I believe we need to put more innovation in the ground, especially for small farmers, to not only to mitigate, but to adapt of what's going on in the world. We need to put in place infrastructure, for example, for providing water to the plots. And when I'm talking about water, it's new techniques in which you have access to water, but also that you use it in a more efficient way. Micro dropping, for example, to provide the water. I've seen examples in which you can increase production and reduce water consumption by 80%. And these are investments that are not huge investments. They are actually relatively simple investments that, with the support of state or of key allies, small farmers can do. In helping small farmers, I point out this a lot because they represent the most part of the producers and a large part of the production. This is a way in which you can protect food security for the country and for the world. You can mitigate and adapt and fix carbon in terms of climate change. You can tackle inequality if you provide this tool to small peasants, small farmers. And also, you can fight against, for example, people having to be displaced due to climate or other reasons. That we're talking about migration here. This has a lot to do with trade as well. We need to recognize this not only in the field and the support to small farmers, but also in the international markets. And I think about Central America, my own region. We're going to be hit constantly by hurricanes, and science says that hurricanes are going to be tougher. They're going to be harder because of climate change. So we need to give support to adapt to this situation, to reduce the emissions. And there are experiences that are not that expensive, but we need to deploy in a larger manner. We in Costa Rica had the experience of developing the NAMA, that is the nationally appropriate mitigation actions. For example, in 2015, we created the NAMA coffee. So that means that our coffee production, more than half of the production is produced that way. So it's not only better for the planet, but it's also, it gets better prices on the international markets. And through the decarbonization plan we launched in 2019, we are doing that also in musaceas, that means in bananas, plantains, in rice, in sugarcane, also working the NAMA on livestock for beef production. So those fields are very promising. I feel hopeful about that, but I think that policy needs to follow innovation in this and needs to believe this to be a key topic. And as I mentioned before, it's such a central topic, but it's not necessarily on the top of the agenda.
Very good point that you bring up, NAMA. That's National Action Mitigation of Agriculture, for those who don't know. And Costa Rica has been a pioneer in this space. We do have a couple of questions coming in, President Alvarado, if it's okay. Why don't we insert one now?
Sure.
And this is from Dorothea Leiker of Columbia Crossroads in the US. And it's about the Amazon. And just to simplify the question, the Amazon seems to be nearing a tipping point, which could have tremendous impacts on food production in Latin America and indeed the world. What's your view on whether or not where we are with the Amazon right now is something that can be recovered or mitigated, as you have done in Costa Rica?
Well, the answer is going to sound weird in this case, but let me go to the Inflation Reduction Act for a bit. That's been one of the key milestones in President Biden administration, and I think it has been one of the key steps in the United States in terms of sustainability. I do believe that that same philosophy applied in the Inflation Reduction Act should be the philosophy applied regionally. If we are playing in this globalization regionally, we need to see the Western Hemisphere as the region in which we play. It's our team. So that means the whole Americas is it's a team itself. I do believe that we all need to play, and we need to team up with Brazil in this sense and with all the countries in the Amazonas to provide the help needed, not only to continue the work in food security, but at the same time to protect the Amazons. And people say, no, that's impossible. You cannot do that. Well, the example of Costa Rica shows that it is possible. We are relevant exporters of agricultural goods, and we have made that at the same time that we have recovered 20% of coverage, of forest coverage we used to have on the 80s, and nowadays we have 57% of forest coverage. That means that you can be a relevant exporter, and at the same time, you can expand the coverage of forests. That requires lots of innovation. That requires several schemes, but also that shows that it is possible to do that. But in order to do that, we need to team up. We need to team up and make it happen. So I think the piece that is lacking is that alliance in which we work together in making that happen, and not only leaving the countries with Amazonia, they're saying or expecting them to by their own only take care of it. We need to team up in order to make this happen.
Interesting point. Thank you for making that. And we're going to hear from agriculture ministers and secretaries in a bit. Secretary Vilsack of the USDA will be addressing this event, as will the EU Commissioner of Agriculture. They talk a lot about that small farm support that you're mentioning and how important that is. And we've got another question, and I want to kind of meld it together a little bit in that teamwork that you're talking about, but also how we're working our supply chains and the impact there. So this is from Klaus Mager of Bend, Oregon. He's at Climate System Solutions. And his point is that the food industry seems to need to decentralize its supply chain. The monocrop practices for commodities, destructive to soil and watersheds, and disrupt local economies. Wouldn't it make sense to focus on local farm to fork systems and help those countries with know-how, technology, and resources to make that happen? Indeed, Secretary Vilsack will talk about a new program that USDA is rolling out called Climate Smart Commodities, where they are rewarding small organizations, small farm holders and producers who create commodities with lower levels of carbon and emissions. Do we need to decentralize our food supply chains?
I think it does make great sense also because that decentralization makes you more resilient. And there are lots of risks associated with climate change as it has been exposed because of droughts, because of hurricanes, because of floodings. So not only we need to work like insurance schemes to protect farmers to these risks, but also distributing the risk is a good idea. So that's why decentralizing is a good idea. So that's also why working with small farmers, it's a perfect way of doing this. And it has lots of benefits. I think about Central America. Whenever a hurricane hits, or a drought hits, or flooding hits, or low market prices hit, or flooding, but not of water, but of products from other markets, whatever happens is that you have farmers on the move. You have farmers migrating. So you're losing that capacity to produce locally, and you're also losing livelihoods that end up as being people that it's migrating. So in many senses, the case is there to work on protecting and working with small farmers locally, given technology, given innovation, thinking about trade in these terms of climate and of migration as well. It does make a lot of sense. And when in the one thing that I found here in the United States, when you think about allies, and you mentioned the word allies, the next thing you say is Europe. Nobody thinks about allies and then says Latin America, which I found it interesting in a mindset perspective. And if you see the exports in Latin America, they've been shifting a lot from working with Europe and the US to working with China. And that's a reality. So I think that we need to put that on the table when discussing this topic about food security.
President Alvarado, that is a really interesting point to make, and we could go on talking about that, but unfortunately, we are out of time. All I have to say is, in addition, a thank you, congratulations to the students who are benefiting from your wisdom at Tufts Fletcher. They are indeed privileged, and you're going to graduate some great diplomats going forward. Thank you so much for all that you do and for joining us here at Food Plus.
Thank you very much, Andrew. My pleasure.
Next up, we'll hear from experts for a discussion on sustainability in the fisheries industry. Joining veteran journalist Maggie Lake are Teresa Ish, the Oceans Initiative lead and senior program officer at the Walton Family Foundation, Dr. Tom Pickerell, the executive director of the Global Tuna Alliance, and Brandon Amasuk, the VP of Natural Resources at Kaweruk, an Alaska-based organization supporting the cooperation of Native tribes and advocating for their needs.
Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here today and for the opportunity to participate once again in FP's Food Summit. Teresa, Tom, and Brandon, thank you all for being here.
Good morning.
Thanks for having us.
Teresa, I'd like to start with you. And we were just hearing a robust discussion about agriculture. Can you talk to us a little bit about what role sustainable fishing plays in strengthening the global food system?
Yeah, I thought that was a really great session to follow up because I think a lot of the challenges facing agriculture in the face of climate change are very similar to what we see in fisheries. And people often do forget that fish are food. More than 3 billion people rely on fisheries as their main source of protein. Most of these people live in developing countries. More than 250 million people are directly employed by the fishing industry, and the majority of them are small-scale fishermen and fishers. 27 million coastal indigenous communities rely on seafood. And this is not just about the small-scale fisheries. This is also a global issue. Seafood is the most valuable globally traded food commodity. That's more than beef, coffee, chocolate. And so there really is this global impact around how we manage our fisheries. And we also know that healthy fish are the basis of a healthy ocean. And when we take care of the fish and the fish stocks, we are, by extension, taking care of the entire ocean and the people who rely on them. So it is not just about the oceans and the fish. It really is a global food issue. And like many of our other food production methods, it's being impacted by climate change.
Teresa, it's such a good point. It's not just food, it's also when you're talking about the health of the ocean. So it's two pronged, which I think is really important to sort of set the stage with that observation. Tom, your organization was created a couple of years ago, I understand, to address the issue of sustainable fishing. Can you just give us a little bit of background for those who may not be familiar? What is Global Tuna Alliance? What does it do?
Certainly, Maggie. The Global Tuna Alliance was set up in 2019 by seafood companies, including retailers, brands, processors, with an interest in tuna. Tuna is one of the most popular seafoods out there. It's eaten pretty much everywhere around the world. But there are challenges with tuna fisheries management, and that was impacting on the stocks themselves, and it was impacting on the products that these companies could sell to their customers, people like yourself, myself, when we go out shopping. And so, fed up with the glacial pace of improvements, these companies have come together to collectively try to use their commercial leverage to influence the decision makers in tuna fisheries management to actually improve the management of these fisheries, not only for their own benefit, but for the sake of the environment, which of course these fisheries depend on. And there are obviously all these communities that Teresa mentioned that are also dependent on the lifeblood of the tuna fisheries.
Was there a catalyst, or was there some concern? Where are we with fishing stocks that caused the commercial industry, the business industry, to band together in this way?
Yeah, if you look at tuna fisheries themselves, the number of stocks that have healthy numbers of tuna in their stocks is actually reasonably high, and it gives you a false picture. It looks like everything's okay, but these stocks generally, the numbers are decreasing, and we're sort of moving towards that situation where we could get to a point where there are serious troubles. There are at least a couple of tuna fisheries that are overfished, and overfishing is occurring. But what they all have in common is they are really poorly managed. They are generally managed by annual horse trading, annual arguments about who gets what share, how big the science should be. And it's just a nightmare. It's a mess. And these companies were concerned with the fact that because of this poor management, they weren't able to say to their customers that the tuna they were selling was at the level of environmental performance that they wanted to sell and their customers were looking for. So this was the kind of the key thing here, the lack of effective fisheries management. And so what we're doing is we're focusing on improving the management of tuna fisheries around the world. And that's, like I say, using the commercial leverage of all these 50 plus companies to try to influence management decisions.
And that is such an interesting development, I think, when you start to see that happen, and that it's being driven by what they're able to report back to their customers. So we're gonna talk about a little bit about that in a moment. But Brandon, you're based in Alaska and have experienced firsthand the challenges around sustainable fishing. What's the greatest risk to the ecosystem that you track and monitor?
The greatest risk? I don't know that so our communities are heavily reliant upon subsistence caught resources. And with climate change, being able to access those resources, it's getting more and more difficult. The Bering Strait region being sea ice free longer throughout the winter makes it even more difficult to access those resources. And where I'm going with that is when there's less sea ice, the ocean is more susceptible to high winds, big waves, and a lot of our communities are right on the coast.
It's worth pointing out, Brandon, for those who may not be aware, your organization represents 20 tribes in Alaska and looks at how individuals and subsistence fishermen and the environment are being impacted by what's happening in the Bering Sea. Is the situation accelerating? How much of an issue is timing here? Are the changes increasing rapidly, mirroring what we're seeing happening in climate elsewhere?
More or less, yes. Hearing other speakers, climate change, it's a big topic here in the Bering Strait region. Again, we're seeing it on the forefront, maybe faster than any place else. It's, again, being able to access those resources climate change fast forwarding everything, including commercial shipping. The Northwest Passage opening up more commercial vessels coming through of all kinds, but also commercial fishing wanting to move farther north. Currently, the northern Bering Sea is off limits to bottom trawling, but we have industry pounding on the back door wanting to access what may be possible resources.
So I'm hearing two pressing issues there. One is, of course, what's happening with the climate, but the other is the changes in commercial activity infringing on what was traditional fishing territory for you. Again, maybe because of climate. Teresa, I think this really speaks to the table you said at the beginning about the connection with all these issues and the deep connection between sustainable fishing and climate change. You can't separate out the two, can you?
You really can't. I mean, this is something that is affecting fisheries of all sizes. And I think to Brandon's point as well about the impact that climate change and commercial fishing is having on his community, there is this tension as we call for eating more seafood because it's a low carbon fish. And frankly, the fact that we've seen fish stocks improve when they are well managed. The real flip side to that I think, people in communities like Brandon have known for years, but I think many of us in philanthropy and fisheries management are coming to see is that many of those management decisions that have made in the past have not been made with a lens around equity and a conversation around who gets to access these fish. And so we're trying to now understand, how do you help protect a resource, protect a sector, get fish to people who rely on it, who need it for micronutrients, for low carbon sources of animal protein, and balance the needs of these coastal communities and these indigenous communities that have deep cultural roots and deep knowledge around how those fisheries are changing, how to manage those fisheries. And this is a tension that fisheries management agencies, advocacy groups, governments have been working on. But what we need to do is to create more access for these fishing communities to help have a say in how these resources are managed, because it is so important for people both to access fish while still ensuring that the fish populations are healthy in the long run.
Brandon, I feel like I have to go back to you because I know that this is an issue that you're very focused on. What is the participation? What are the barriers you found in terms of having a seat at the table in this decision making?
So currently, rural communities, Alaska, we don't have a seat at the table. The chance we get to possibly sway changes is, as a community member, we get 3 minutes to testify. So where my area is a little more focused on is, again, subsistence, at the local level, in particular for like salmon. But where our resources are being impacted is in the commercial bottom trawling, in particular for pollock and Pacific cod. So there's a North Pacific Fishery Management Council that is, my understanding, governed by National Marine Fisheries Service. But again, other than testifying, we have no say-so. And hundreds of thousands of salmon are caught as bycatch, yet when in times of closure, the subsistence user is not allowed to even harvest one.
I think this brings us back to the comments President Alvarado just made in the session before us about having to have support when you're talking about small farmers. I assume the same would be the case here when you're talking about either small fishing communities or organizations or subsistence fishing. Tom, I would love for you to weigh in. I'm assuming the complexities we're hearing are exactly what the problem is when you're talking about trying to have adequate management of fishing stocks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, to the point about representation, the market hasn't got representation either. I'll give you an example of that. In 2019, the last time before COVID, when all the tuna regional fishery management organizations met in person. I did an analysis of who was on the European Union delegation. There was no market representation on the 4 meetings at all. The majority of the delegations were the industrial catching sector. So it's for us as well, and I completely understand the frustration. It's how do we and the artisanal fishermen get our point of view heard at that official level? The management complexities are there, are completely there. One of the challenges is allocation. It's who gets what share of a fishery. How do you do that? You need a mechanism for that to work, but then everyone needs to agree on the mechanism. But then if someone's going to lose on that, then they're not going to agree on it. And so you end up with this situation where people can, well, they have done in the Northeast Atlantic, for example, countries set unilateral quotas from a shared stock. So they say, right, well, we don't agree with the collective approach. We're just going to set our own quota. And that's where the system breaks down. And as Teresa says, it's when fisheries are well managed, they rebound really quickly and they remain healthy. And and then there for everyone. It's a sustainable resource. It's absolutely not rocket science. Manage them properly.
So what's been the reaction now that you are trying to flex your muscle? You didn't have a seat at the table before, but you're participating in these meetings. You're there. What's been the reaction?
So yes, we're annoying the right people, which is always the best way of going, I think. And give an example in the Indian Ocean, yellowfin tuna, really important particularly for the European market. It's overfished, and overfishing is occurring. So we've taken too much, and we are taking too much, which is the worst situation you can be in. Now, the market, we find that unacceptable. And several companies have come out and made very public statements about their sourcing of Indian Ocean yellowfin. Tesco's, for example, one of the world's biggest retailers, has stopped buying tuna from the Indian Ocean for their own brand because of the poor management of yellowfin. Prince's, which is one of the key brands, they've reduced their sourcing by 50% from that region. And one of the outcomes of that is, at the meeting of the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, the delegates raised this issue of what they called a market boycott, and made a public statement that they will address the situation, and also set up a special session of the commission to actually try to implement a rebuilding plan. So you can see there is that thread that goes from the sourcing all the way through to the management. And what we're doing is we're just repeating that in other tuna areas, tuna fisheries and tuna stocks.
So interesting. Teresa, we've seen the progress that can be made on the climate side when businesses that are walking the walk, I don't want to, broadly brush everyone with the same, effectiveness. But businesses who are serious about this, when they have a seat at the table, when they flex their muscle, when they say our consumers want this, and they reach down into their supply chain, we have seen it move the needle. Or we certainly see the potential for that. Is this beginning to happen? Can this be a force that will help move the needle here when we're talking about sustainable fishing, even though it's early days?
I think on the environment side, we have seen a lot of those commitments come up. I think there are a handful of companies like the ones that Tom works with that are really actively engaged in getting that management in place. I think the reality is, because the management is hard, and frankly, many governments are not prioritizing managing their fisheries resources, we still need to see more action in pushing for that management. I will say, in terms of the participation and engagement of fishing communities and indigenous fishing communities, advocating for them to have a seat at the table, that is not on the radar of many of these fishing companies and the retailers. And I think that's especially surprising given how much of our global supply is still caught by small scale fishers. There's a perception that that all the fish that we eat, say in the United States, is caught by these big boats. There are small canoes in Indonesia that catch tuna for our sashimi restaurants. And so those fishers in Indonesia, their livelihoods rely, and their communities rely on having a resource there, and they can't manage that resource by themselves. They're one person, 100 people. And frankly, they have to be able to kind of beat down that door in the conversation to say, we deserve access to this fish, and we are committed to stewarding this resource for the long term because our lives, our communities, our cultures depend on it. And that, I think, is a conversation that we have to continue to push, both from the companies when they're seeking out sustainably managed fisheries and advocating for sustainable management, but also within the countries themselves. But I think the real challenge here is it's just not a priority of many of these countries. And yet the risks for migration if fisheries are overfished, the risk to real food security issues in these coastal communities, it is strong. And so it needs to be a bigger priority of companies who rely on the fisheries, of the countries that are responsible for managing these fisheries resources, to take those hard steps. As Tom mentioned, they are difficult to have these conversations around how do you fairly allocate fish, but it can happen. And the countries or the companies that have made these commitments to buy sustainable seafood now need to extend those commitments to, we actually need to commit to making sure that fisheries are improving so that we have sustainable seafood.
Brandon, what policies or programs would help address the problem? What would you like to see in Alaska?
Well, I think I spoke to it a little bit before. So, I mean, actually having a seat at the table when decisions are made. Again, communities get, as an individual person, a few minutes to testify, provide comments on behalf of their communities or even their region. When, again, I'll use the North Pacific Fishery Management Council as an example. Almost the entire council is one-sided, industry-driven. There's other comments that were made here, kind of sound like the same thing. But where's the equality? Where's the, in the decision-making process when an entire board is made up of industry? Again, getting a seat at the table, having meaningful, equitable engagement, having our concerns taken seriously. Again, and I mentioned it earlier, the industry is allowed to waste hundreds of thousands of salmon when me as the single user, I'm not even allowed to harvest one in times of shortage.
Absolutely, which really underscores the problem. Tom, what are some of the opportunities you see for partnership? Is public-private cooperation the way forward? It sounds like it's governments that are central to resolving this, or at least making proactive steps to improve fishing stocks. How do you see the issue of partnership playing out?
Yeah, I've been in the sustainable seafood world for over 20 years, and I've never seen as much movement in such a rapid time as when the market becomes aligned around an issue. And that's not really surprising because they can lever the fact that they're tax paying and their business interests. So I think developing this further is absolutely the opportunity. How we'd like to see it progress is working much more closely with the NGO community, because we do share the same aims. And it is to have that joint approach of the NGO community and all their supporters saying this is completely echoed by the market, which also wants this, civil society, all saying the same thing to the decision makers. And as you rightly say, Maggie, it is the governments who are making these decisions. There's no one else. They're advised by stakeholders. And as Brandon said, many of these are the industrial catching sector, which are very, very good at advocacy. And that's not to be criticized. That's what they set out to do, and they're very good at it. But we need to get smarter, and we need to actually be very targeted about what we want and what the consequences are if it doesn't happen. I think the key thing here is consequences, because otherwise it's just, it's commitments without actions. One one example I can give you is the North Atlantic Pelagic Advocacy Group, or NAPA, which is working in a very similar way on mackerel, herring, and blue whiting in the Northeast Atlantic. 60 companies have come together to essentially call for the scientific advice to be followed and long-term management to be put in place. Each of these companies has made a public sourcing commitment that says this is what's going to happen if the improvements are not made by a particular deadline, which I think is 2024. And some of these commitments include walking away from sourcing from the region entirely. Some will only source from those fisheries, from those countries that are acting responsibly. And others have said they will pay less. There will be a business impact. They will continue sourcing, but they will pay less. And that gets people's attention. So I think, there's a model there that can be replicated in other areas.
And I think that's important to lean into what's working and what can be scaled, Teresa, because that's really the key, isn't it? What are you focused on in terms of the bright light you see and maybe a way forward to scale? And the other question I have is, it connects into the broader climate issue, but is it helping in terms of finding those solutions that can scale across agriculture? And if it works in agriculture, let's try it in sustainable fishing as well. Or is it a competition for resources? Because we have seen that in the past as well.
Yeah, and Maggie, I think your comparisons to climate are really important. I mean, as Tom mentioned earlier, managing fisheries is something we know how to do, and we know it works. And so there always is this hopefulness, I think, of folks who work on fisheries, in that, like, we know what to do, we just need people to do it. And I think these issues of corporate commitment, international cooperation, how do we decide who's at the table, are all very parallel to the conversations folks are having in the climate space. I think one of the things that I'm seeing that is exciting, the COP this year had its first Oceans Pavilion. And that is so important in recognizing the oceans as part of climate change, both as part of the solutions, but also something that is being radically and drastically affected by it. And so that attention to oceans finally is a huge step forward. However, very few countries have fisheries and aquaculture and blue food production as part of their nationally determined contribution to the Paris Climate Accord. We could see more countries really leaning in to addressing fisheries through that mechanism. I think some of the same equity issues that are a challenge in climate are a challenge in fisheries. So much of the fish that we eat in the United States and that developed countries eat around the world are imported from developing countries, many in the tropics where climate change will affect those fisheries. So I think it's great to have models to lean into. The hard work of getting adoption, getting attention is still there, but I think there are sparks there so that that we can keep building that, we can keep leaning into that. We're seeing more funder attention from private donors than we've ever seen on climate and oceans. We need to make sure that some of that is directed to fisheries adaptation, that supports communities, that supports better management for the large-scale fisheries, that helps us secure food security for the globe, which is so dependent on oceans resources and will increasingly be so as agriculture is threatened by climate change. So really making sure that fish are seen as part of that bigger food system and food security issue, that it's not just an oceans issue, it really is a people, a planet, a food, and an economic issue. But I think that's changing, that's starting, we're seeing more attention there, and I think that's the first step, and it's really exciting.
Absolutely. And I think as the conversation, certainly when I'm talking to business executives working on this issue, the conversation about focusing on issues that if you resolve that issue, you can check many of the SDGs. And I think sustainable fishing certainly falls into that. And also plugging in the conversation of equity. That has been more recent, but is very much a focus now as you're looking at this sort of through the broader lens, making all of those connections. And again, pulling in some of the other SDGs as you tackle food and climate. Brandon, it's all I think always worth reminding everyone what's at stake. So we have the progress, but what's at stake, especially when we're talking about local fishermen and fishing villages and subsistence fishing. What are you seeing? What are you hearing from your community members in terms of their personal challenges based on some of the difficulties they're facing, some of the changes in commercial fishing, heading further into territory that they've never seen before? What kind of impact is it having on the ground? Can you just bring us some of the color from your local community in terms of what you're hearing?
So the impacts that we're facing, directly, indirectly, the not being able to harvest salmon as we used to. There have been studies that show the traditional diet was comprised about 80% of salmon. Yet in times of closure, I've mentioned this before, numerous times, we're not even allowed to harvest one. The Southern Seward Peninsula, we had a chum salmon closure that lasted nearly 30 years. And again, I keep mentioning it, I hate to sound like a broken record, but it's in times of closure, we're not allowed to harvest one, yet industry is allowed to waste hundreds of thousands. In 2007, I believe it was, the bottom trawling was allowed to have bycatch of, I think it was 750,000 chum salmon. Yet in times of closure, we're not allowed to harvest one. When fisheries are open back up, we're on it has come down to a tier 2 system. Basically, individuals have to apply, and it's based off of, I guess, like longevity, like how long a person has lived in a community that has them score higher. But then it also creates fighting amongst community members at the community level. Why does this person get to fish? I've been here for 80 years, but the other person was here for like 81 years. So we're seeing that now. We're having a multi-salmon species crash. All 5 species of salmon across the board the last 2 years, very low returns. And that's something else that industry doesn't want to accept, is that the salmon that they bycatch when they're targeting pollock and Pacific cod, those same salmon are going to return to Western Alaska rivers to complete their cycle. But yet, we're not even able to access that.
Yeah, I think that really underscores the importance of when we're talking about, looking at the globe, what a small area, the important role it plays in that ecosystem, and its contribution to the broader global food supply. And you've got to think there could be a better way to do that. Teresa or Tom, very interesting question from Matthew Ellingson in DC, Compassion International. I'm not sure if either of you, who's best situated to answer this, but ocean fish represent the only non-GMO animal protein available at scale for global food crises. What happened to the efforts to harvest plentiful but less valuable species for nutrient-rich fish-based nutritional supplements, a project once pioneered by ASMI, Alaska Seafood Marketing Institute, in coordination with private companies? Are either of you aware of any efforts to harvest plentiful but less valuable species in order to address this?
I'm happy to jump in unless you'd like to, Teresa.
Sure, Tom, go for it.
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
I think there's been a lot of work on the so-called sort of less commercially attractive fish to try to get that to market. To give an example, in the UK, there's been plenty of effort to try to get fish that the fishing communities have in the past thrown away because there'd been no market for them. Whether that's for direct to food or whether that's for other purposes, it does really depend on the species. But a lot of that is sometimes prompted by regulations such as ban on discards, so the ban on throwing away fish, and so you have to have better utilization of that. There's also been some successes. I'll give you an example. We have a dish called Scampi in the UK. which was originally used for monkfish tails before monkfish became itself popular. It would take the tails and put them in breadcrumbs and deep fry them, as we tend to do in the UK. And so there are examples, throughout the seafood history of better utilization. I'm not aware of the project itself, but the question is right. That we have this incredible food source in the oceans. Notwithstanding the challenges around management, if we get the management sorted, we have a sustainable food supply that can at least contribute to feeding the planet. And this is the key issue here. It's a foodstuff.
Yeah.
I think
go ahead, Teresa.
One piece on that too, Maggie, though, is it is really important to remember that no fish is without value. Because these fisheries are still ecosystems. We talk about them like they're food. I think they should be included in conversations about food, but oceans and fisheries are part of ecosystems. So how we harvest, what we take, how much we can take is not just dependent on what that population can produce, but also how that population interacts with other fish populations. And so I think Tom is right to lean into the aspect of how do we actually become more efficient with the fish that we do catch already. And it's important to recognize that maybe fish, just because they don't have commercial value, does not mean they don't have value.
That's a great point, and we see what happens when we realize that after the fact, and trying to undo the damage when we mess with an ecosystem or a part of the ecosystem that we don't fully understand how it connects to everything else. Teresa, you mentioned aquaculture before. We have a question from Dorothea. Do you see a conflict between fisheries and aquaculture, and what would sustainable coexistence look like?
There are conflicts in space, but I think it is really important to recognize that to sustainably manage fisheries, there will be a cap at which we can't take more fish out of the ocean. And we have to figure out what that gap is between demand and the fish that we can produce from the ocean. So aquaculture will be part of our broader food systems. I do think that the conflicts tend to be local. There are environmental impacts from aquaculture, just like there are from fisheries. And so this is, again, one of those cases of how do we make the decisions in a way that's representative of the people impacted, the people closest to the issue, so that when we have to make decisions on fisheries or aquaculture or who gets this fish and who gets that fish, it's done in a transparent way where the stakeholders are involved in that decision making. So it really is a matter of sort of equitable access to decision making and that sort of conflict resolution.
And that cannot be done without transparency across the board. Incredibly important point at every touchstone of the conversation we've had. As we start to wrap up, Brandon, what would you like to leave the audience with? What do you hope they take away from this conversation and understand about the work that you're doing in Alaska?
I guess the people culture, that's being impacted. The Alaska Native people, at least for our region, we've been the stewards of our resources since time immemorial. The never taking more than what is needed in times of shortage. Take less. But with the changing world, climate change, access to new areas, having Indigenous people included, sitting at the table, to help make decisions. You've heard it here already. When a resource is properly managed, it can rebound. Again, having that seat at the table. The Indigenous people of Alaska, we heard climate change, we heard ecosystem. We are also a part of the ecosystem, if that makes sense. You can't have one without the other. Yet here we are, trying to harvest resources, and our resources are dwindling more and more. It's not just fish that are being impacted. There's marine mammals, seabirds, across the board. And with the climate change in our region, we're seeing a complete ecosystem crash. So I guess I could leave it there. But just having the seat at the table.
Yeah. Tom, it's a complex problem, but as we've heard all of you say, there are solutions. We know this is a problem that can be solved, or at least great progress can be made on it. What should be the priority? What needs to happen from your perspective to scale this, to make progress?
I think there needs to be comprehensive management of fisheries, and that incorporates things such as allocations, rights, access agreements, things like everything comprehensively will address many of the challenges. There are obviously downstream challenges as well, but that will be the foundation that will let us proceed with it. And that needs leadership, absolute leadership from countries who are involved in these fisheries. There's too many times these countries take the short-term view. There is that view of, well, if I don't do it, then another country will do it. We need leaders out there. We need them to live by the UN SDGs that they've all signed up to. And we need to see that happen pretty quickly, because we're seeing, as Brandon mentioned, we're seeing some collapses. And while at the minute I don't think we're at a catastrophic level, we could soon get to that.
Absolutely. Thank you all for this fantastic conversation, for all the work you're doing in this area. Teresa, Brandon, and Tom, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
A few days ago, FP CEO Andrew Salinger sat down with U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack to discuss the role of the United States in addressing food insecurity.
Secretary Vilsack, thank you so much for joining us.
It's good to be back.
It's an incredibly challenging time for food systems globally, as we've been discussing on this program. The pandemic stressed supply chains, which were then absolutely decimated by Russia's war on Ukraine. And the war, of course, created tremendous grain shortages in the global south in particular, due to blockades in the Black Sea. The war also triggered an entirely new crisis, the shortage of fertilizers, the inputs for which are largely sourced from the Ukraine and Russia. And on top of all of this, we've got to contend with fast accelerating climate change, which both impacts and is impacted by agriculture. So for starters, the USDA is primarily focused on US food systems, ensuring their sustainability, their affordability, and their nutrition. That's a big task. So I'd like to ask you, what's the USDA's role in addressing food security globally?
Well, it's a great question, and let me try to address it in the 3 C's that you've identified: COVID, conflict, and climate change. On the COVID side, really about 30% of everything we produce in the United States is ultimately exported. So to the extent it's exported, it does address in some way, shape, or form the question you ask about global food security. So it's important and necessary for us to potentially increase our capacity to more efficiently and more effectively and in a timely way get those exports to market. And that's the reason why it was important for us to engage with our ports to provide resources, to make it a little bit easier for empty containers that were leaving our ports to be filled with agricultural products to meet global demand. It was why the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed also has an impact on our ability over time to improve transportation systems, which will allow us to do a better job of getting product to market. And it's also why we are in the process of expanding our capacity, our processing capacity, to be able to produce more so that we're in a position to respond. So COVID has forced us to be a bit more focused on that supply chain. On the conflict side, we basically looked at ways in which we could potentially increase the production in the U.S. through double cropping. And we know that there's a risk associated with that. So we have created a new risk management tool that basically allowed us to expand almost to the point of doubling the number of acres that are now going to be double cropped in the U.S. We looked at our own capacity to provide financial assistance through the Bill Emerson Trust. We provided a roughly $260 million of additional support to buy grain that would ultimately be shipped to North Africa and the Middle East, areas that were most positively impacted, or negatively impacted rather, by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We've entered into an MOU with the Ukrainian Ag Ministry to basically reassure them that when this war is over, and we hope it's soon, that we're in a position, U.S. agriculture is in a position to provide help and assistance to rebuild that very important and critical aspect of global food development and development. And on the fertilizer side, we looked at ways in which we could actually perhaps require less of the global fertilizer supply by being more self-reliant in terms of fertilizer. We've got a $500 million initiative, which we'll be launching in 2023 to begin the process of expanding domestic production of fertilizer. And on climate, I think you're fully aware of our Climate Smart Agriculture Partnership Initiative, which I suspect we'll go into greater detail with. But so we've been very active and engaged in all of these areas because we understand and appreciate it's not just about the food and nutrition security of Americans, but we also have a responsibility to respond to the global needs as well.
That's great to hear. Thank you, Secretary Vilsack. Let's dig into climate right now. The USDA just announced on Monday an additional investment in your Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities project. I'd love to hear a little bit about that, but just to define for our participants here listening in, a climate smart commodity is, as you define it, an agricultural commodity that is produced using farming, ranching, or forestry practices that reduce greenhouse gas emissions or sequester carbon. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that partnership and the investment that you've just announced.
Well, first and foremost, it's voluntary. Farmers can participate in this initiative on their own. It's incentive-based. It's not a regulatory regime or structure. It is basically based on the notion that there's a risk involved in the adoption of climate-smart practices on the farm and on the ranch and in forested lands. And we wanted to reduce that risk, the financial risk associated with doing things a little bit differently. So we're actually helping farmers by giving them the resources to adopt and accelerate the adoption of climate smart practices. We know that there are roughly 45 practices on the farm, in ranches, and on forested lands that could potentially reduce greenhouse gas emissions or could sequester carbon. But what we want to know is whether or not we can create market opportunities for those commodities, whether we can team up not just the farmers and ranchers producing these products, but the purchasers ultimately of those products, and whether there is a higher value proposition for the producers out of this. So we essentially put $1 billion initially on the table and challenged American food and agriculture industry to respond. What would you do with those resources? Frankly, we were quite surprised by the reaction. We received over 1,050 applications, totaling nearly $20 billion in requests. We divided those applications into two tranches. The first tranche, large grants that were anywhere from $5 million over 3 to 5 years to as much as $100 million. And the second tranche, which was smaller grants, anywhere from $250,000 to $5 million. In the first pot, we received about 450 applications. We were able to select 70 for tentative agreements, roughly $18 billion in requests, but we were only able to fund about $2.8 billion of that. We had to increase the $1 billion by tapping the Commodity Credit Corporation. So we're going to provide resources over the next 3 to 5 years. Several components about these projects. They're large. They're in all 50 states. Every commodity is involved. We expect and anticipate about 50,000 producers will be engaged. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 million acres will be engaged. And from this, we will also have a serious and significant monitoring, measuring, and verification and certification initiative. We're not just going to provide farmers money. We're going to monitor what happens. We're going to try to figure out what works and, frankly, what doesn't work, so that we can then tie significant resources under the Inflation Reduction Act into additional acceleration and long-term investment by our producers. And this is important. The announcement we made this week was essentially the second tranche, another 71 projects, smaller projects by size, but again, all 50 states basically engaged in this, and a real focus on underserved and small small-sized farming operations. We don't just want this to be a large farmer operation system. We want it to be able to be effective and useful for regardless of the size, regardless of the commodity, regardless of the production method.
And could you give us an example of a project? I know it's a very long list, but maybe just one example that you could share from some of these projects, small or large.
Well, there are a couple. I mean, there are just so many exciting projects. Organic Valley is a dairy company, and basically they're working with dairy farmers, and they're going to have what is called insetting in their contracts. They're going to basically say, if you are able to produce certain outcomes, we're going to essentially reward you for those outcomes, and we will pay a higher price for those outcomes. So that's insetting. One of the project that I'm really excited about, because I think it has implications not just here, but literally around the world, is the notion of rice production and an alternative method of irrigation that will essentially significantly reduce the amount of methane that is produced during rice production. As you know, rice normally involves flooding of fields, and as it's flooded, there's a substantial amount of methane that's emitted. If we can figure out ways to significantly reduce methane in rice production, I think it can have an impact not just on our rice, but obviously on rice that's produced all over the world, which I think would be a benefit of this program.
So the goal of this program will be, in addition to generating these innovations at U.S. farms and U.S. commodity production, but also to share the results globally.
Absolutely. We're going to be very transparent about this. We're going to bring people together periodically. We're going to have reports periodically. We're going to be able to provide information and then share it. And there's several avenues for doing this. There's the avenue within the Climate Smart Partnership Initiative, where we will meet on a regular basis and provide the public here information that will be disseminated and available. We also have established, and this was announced at COP27, we've announced the development of several hubs. One of them is an international climate hub. Another is in the Aim for Climate effort, Aim for Climate hub, where we will be able to post and provide information on what's working and what isn't working, so that the rest of the world can determine whether or not any of it's applicable to their agriculture and their food production.
And that AIM program that you mentioned, that you discussed at COP, stands for Agriculture Innovation Mission. That is a development with the UAE. And I understand that you're going to be having a summit in Washington next year focused on AIM.
Right. This has grown dramatically. We now have 250 partners, over 40 governments, a number of nonprofits and for-profit organizations now part of this. We want to bring people together because we now have 30 sprint innovation efforts. These are initiatives by the private sector that are basically designed to identify certain ways of accelerating climate smart practices on the international stage. We want to be able to share, again, what's working and what isn't working within those innovation sprints. We've got about $8 billion of investment that has already been pledged. We hope to be able to continue to build the number of partners, the number of sprint initiatives, as well as the amount of investment.
Excellent. And just to switch gears for a second, FP Analytics, the research and analysis arm of FP, has just produced a report on food loss and waste, which our attendees can access at a link at the bottom of the page, actually, that you're looking at right now. And in it, we talk about the dual problem of loss, food loss, which is primarily an issue in developing markets due to cold chain issues and logistics needs, and then as well waste, which is mostly a problem in developed markets like the US, which are a bit more profligate with their consumption. What is the USDA doing to tackle the issue of food loss and waste? Again, focused on the US, but whatever you could share globally as well. It's an important issue impacting not just productivity, but also climate.
Well, no question about it, because that food waste ultimately, at least in the US, ends up in landfills, and that's another methane producer that's pretty significant and serious. We have a food loss and waste challenge. We coordinated with the EPA a number of years ago in basically challenging US industry and US government to work collaboratively together to try to identify strategies for the reduction of waste. We have several thousand companies now as part of that challenge. We are also investing significant resources within USDA in composting activities across many urban centers throughout the U.S. We just announced about $30 million of grants to expand composting. We're in the process of finalizing additional investments in terms of strategies that can be sort of lifted up as a national challenge or a national strategy, working again with our partners. So we do take this issue very, very seriously. Obviously, we're engaged in it as well within USDA as we look at ways in which we can reduce our own waste generated within USDA. We're working on recipes. We're working on educating our SNAP families, for example, roughly 43 million Americans benefiting from that program. We can help them stretch their dollar, if you will, by encouraging them to think about how better to utilize the food that they have. We continue to work with our partners at FDA and others to make sure that we have a clear understanding on the part of consumers about what it means when it says sell by and buy, use by dates, and making sure that those are accurate and appropriate. And so there's a great deal of activity. We're working with Congress as they look at the charitable donation rules in terms of foods and so forth that can be potentially provided, avoiding waste from institutional purchasers or institutional providers of food. So there's a great deal of activity in this space domestically. On the international side, we work with our partner USAID to basically provide resources so folks can begin the process of strengthening their supply chain, as you mentioned, with cold storage, refrigeration, understanding the need and the ways in which they can safely handle food to extend it. And I would say that our researchers are looking at a variety of ways to extend the shelf life of food. There's some interesting strategies in terms of specialty crops that could potentially expand and significantly increase the life of, if you will, of fruits and vegetables with coverings and things of that nature. So there's a lot going on in this space, and obviously it's a very significant component, as you say, of climate.
Thanks for sharing, and it's great to hear that the USDA is so proactive on this very important issue. We're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask one last question. We're about to hear from Janusz Wojciechowski, the EU Commissioner of Agriculture, your peer in Europe. And I'm kind of curious how you work with your counterparts in other regions to solve these problems. Maybe you could share a little bit if you work with Janusz or any of the other agriculture ministers to coordinate your efforts and solve for problems globally together.
Well, actually, the commissioner and I met last year for the purpose of announcing a collaborative effort on the part of the EU and the US focused on a number of issues, including sustainability and climate. And so we have had a series of workshops, a series of ongoing technical discussions, ways in which we can advance each other's efforts in terms of sustainable agricultural production, in terms of ensuring that we are responding to the climate challenge. This would also be true of our Aim for Climate initiative. Obviously, the EU is part of that as well, and we are encouraging countries and ministers from countries across the world that I meet with to participate in Aim for Climate. We also have a sustainable productivity coalition, which we are building. One of the challenges in this space is that there's this belief that somehow you have to sacrifice productivity for sustainability, or conversely, that you have to sacrifice sustainability to be more productive. We don't believe that here in the US. We think that you can do both. But to do both, it requires innovation. It requires an understanding of the science. It requires a rules-based, science-based trading system that ensures that these innovations can get into the market and be respected in the market. And it requires collaboration and the sharing of information. I think there is enough demand, and will continue to be enough demand as we see a expanded global population to keep all the farmers in the world busy in terms of productivity, especially given climate. And so we need, I think, to work collaboratively to communicate together. So we've established the Aim for Climate, the collaborative platform for agriculture with the EU, the Sustainable Productivity Coalition, which is a larger group of like-minded ag-based countries to basically facilitate that collaboration and communication. So a lot going on in that space.
That's fantastic, Secretary Vilsack, and it's really good to hear that USDA and other organizations around the world are working globally to solve these issues. It's very heartening. Thank you so much for spending time with us this morning. We really appreciate it. It's great to talk with you.
You bet. Thank you.
Next, we look across the Atlantic for a conversation with Janusz Wojciechowski, the EU's Commissioner for Agriculture, who provides his take on the impacts of the current crisis in Ukraine and the efforts being made to secure agricultural supply chains in and out of Europe.
Commissioner, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. That's my pleasure to meet you and to have opportunity to discuss about our challenges for the agriculture, for the food security. Thank you for invitation.
You're very welcome and happy to have you here. Obviously, a lot has changed since you took on the portfolio as Commissioner for Agriculture since 2019. First, the pandemic came and impacted everything that we're doing in farming and agriculture. That was followed closely by the Ukraine war and now endemic food insecurity around the world. And I'd love to get the perspective from you just on your portfolio and your role and what you've been focused on, how that's changed over the course of the past short 3 years in your role as Commissioner for Agriculture.
Thank you very much for this question. Yes, it's you're right. This is the 3 years of the mandate of the Madam President von der Leyen Commission, and also my mandate as a Commissioner for Agriculture. And just after the start of the Commission work, 1st of December 2019, 3 months later, there was a beginning of the huge crisis, huge health crisis, economic crisis because of COVID-19 pandemic, affecting also our food system, affecting our agriculture, our farmers. But thanks to our farmers, the food security during this pandemic crisis was ensured everywhere in the European Union. This is great achievement of our farmers that they were able to ensure the food security in this crisis situation. For the Commission, it was challenged that's to intervene in the crisis situation. Like, for example, there was a problem with the transport of the agricultural products. We organized the green corridors for the agricultural products, for the food. The problem with the workers, agricultural workers, that's they also the problem of the border blockade, and we organize also the special treatment of the agricultural workers to allow them to pass the borders. There was many market interventions in the crisis situation. All time the crisis management, but thanks to our farmers, as I said, the food security was ensured in European Union, and also the contribution of the European Union into the global food security. Also because the European Union is the biggest food exporter in the world, the biggest global exporter, and it was also maintained the role of the European Union as a big food exporter at the global market. And what was the lesson from the crisis, the COVID crisis? That we need to strengthen that. First of all, the local production. The role of small family farms is very important for the local food supply chain, which is in the crisis situation. This is very important. And the next crisis, this is the huge crisis, which is caused by the Russian illegal and unprovoked aggression against Ukraine.
Well, many have had to deal with the polycrises and specifically this dual crises of the pandemic and the Ukraine war. But it's great that the response has been tested and successful. And I'd love to get back a little later to your support of small-scale farming in particular. But you mentioned fertilizer. Maybe we could start with the impacts of the Ukraine war on farming and food. And in fertilizers in particular, we really see an example of how energy and food and agriculture collide. And it would be very helpful to understand from you how this is impacting farming in Europe in particular.
A few weeks ago, we published the communication on the fertilizer. There are some actions. Now, first of all, this is state aid. We open possibility of the state aid, for example, for the fertilizers companies producing the fertilizers. The possible support is 150 million euro for the one individual company producing fertilizers. This is possible also support for the farmers. That's maximum amount is now the 250,000 euro for individual farm. And now there is also the Commission initiative to suspend the tariffs for import of urea and ammonia, which are needed for the fertilizer production. There are some possibilities for the member states to, for example, to organize like public procurement of not procurement to buy fertilizers by the state agencies and to sell for the farmers in lower prices. They are instruments which can be used by member states to support the farmers in this difficult situation. Organic farming, they have chance. They can be farmers. This is our response for this situation.
Certainly, and there's a more efficient application of fertilizers as well. There have been some discussions of how there may have been over fertilization in some regions, so more effective use of fertilizer as well. Of course, there's cautionary tales around the world, as in Sri Lanka, where organic farming was adopted on a widespread basis and caused issues and shortages in food and crises. So it must be applied carefully. A lot of these issues with fertilizers, of course, are impacting other regions, especially Africa. You talked about importing urea, for example. Africa is dealing with tremendous food insecurity due to climate change, and you talked about the EU support of Ukraine, grain from Ukraine. Tonight, live in Washington, I'll be speaking in person with Agnes Kalibata, who you may know. She's president of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. And she has spoken in past about how Africa needs to produce its own fertilizer precisely because of issues like this. Well, some of the pros and cons of such a development, of course, revolve around climate and whether or not we should be producing more fertilizer, which is not negative on the climate and issues that we're trying to face right now. And I'm just kind of curious your view on that from the EU perspective on Africa creating its own fertilizer industry and ability to be more self-sustaining on that front.
No, that's in Africa. I think the main challenge is to support, especially the small farmers in Africa. That's the fertilizer production. All farmers need the fertilizers. Of course, we need to also to create the alternative for the chemical fertilizer. But we generally we need the fertilizers. All farmers they need to use the fertilizers. Excluding organic farmers because there is they don't use. But in Africa, I think that the main challenge is to support the small farmers. You know that according to the FAO data, that's the smallest farmers, less than 2 hectares. They used only 12% of the agricultural land in the world, but they produce 35% of food. And to support the programs, we have many programs supporting African farmers, but generally our intention is to increase their potential to produce food in Africa, not to because sometimes there is vision that we need to deliver food, deliver grain from from Ukraine, from European Union. This is very important, of course, but to solve the problems of Africa in long perspective, we need to strengthen their potential to produce food in Africa, not to only to export food to Africa. Yes, and but no, this is long-term process. But for example, to deliver them technology, the machineries, especially for the small farmers, this is the action which is needed to Africa.
You clearly have strong feelings about small-scale farming and helping to reduce the cost of productive input. Maybe you could tell us a little bit back to Europe about your support for small-scale farming and some of the initiatives that the EU is undertaking to underpin small-scale farmers?
According to the last census that describing the situation in European agriculture, comparing to 10 years before, this is the 2010 and 2020, we lost 3 million farms in European Union. The number of farms 2010 was 12 million. Now we have 9 million farms in European Union, 25% less. And this is, we are concerned about this. Because from one hand, okay, we have maybe the average size of the farm was increased. For some comments that it is okay. My comment is it is not okay, because we lost firstly the many small farms, but there is sometimes there's opinion that productive farming should be in large scale. That the large scale farming is more productive. It is not true according to the hard statistic data. You know which country is the most productive in European Union? This is Italy. The global value of the agricultural production and also the gross added value of the agricultural production, the biggest in European Union is Italy. But the system of agriculture in Italy is based on the small farms. The average size of the farm is 11 hectares. But the secret is good organization of the whole food system. Farmers, local processing industry, and also in the small scales, in the scale appropriate to the structure of agriculture, structure of farming, and the distribution, the local market, openness for the openness the market for the local farmers. This is the direction which we should be supported. We support this direction. This is one of the direction of the farm to fork strategy, to increase short supply chain and to reduce the distance from farm to fork. Because now we transport the transport average distance from farm to fork is the statistic distance, each piece of food from farm to table is about the 180 kilometers. That our ambition is to reduce very significantly this distance, to supporting first of all the local supply chain, and it is included into the strategic plans of the common agricultural policy for member states, and I hope that we will achieve the positive results. Which
will also be a boon to climate and a fantastic tool, of course, for delicious and fresh food as well, which works very well in concert with that. Commissioner, that's all we have time for today. We really do appreciate your spending time with us today. We know you're very busy, and thank you for all that you do.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for interesting discussion.
Last week, Foreign Policy Editor-in-Chief Ravi Agrawal hosted the president of Open Society Foundations, Mark Malloch-Brown, for a conversation on what investments are needed to scale a response to the food crisis.
Mark Malloch-Brown, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Mark, so I thought I'd begin with this. You've worn so many different hats in your career at the UNDP, the World Bank, and today you run the Open Society Foundations, which of course is the world's largest private funder of human rights causes. So I suppose we should begin with this. How do you frame food as an open society issue?
It's a very good question. And if this was a regular food crisis that the world was facing, I think it would be outside the scope of OSF, but it's not a regular food crisis. It's a crisis which is a product of, or a consequence of, geopolitics and supply chain breakdowns and disruptions caused both by that geopolitics, but also by the legacy of COVID and other economic disruptions of recent years. And it's because of that complex weaving of the food crisis into a wider crisis of economic and society breakdown, that we consider it very important to our mission of democracy, open societies, and good governance.
And when you see how much of an issue food security has been in 2022, where do you point the finger? I mean, obviously, there's the massive disruption that was the war in Ukraine. But is it that our supply chains are weak? Is it that there are too many people on Earth? Are we not growing enough food? Are we not growing the right kinds of food? What do you see as the biggest driver of problems?
Well, although this was the year the world hit another billion mark in terms of its global population, Mr. Malthus doesn't have an explanation for this crisis. It's not, if you like, a classic crisis of there not being enough food in the world. It is about distribution and affordability, and is a consequence of geopolitical disorder, if I can put it that way. And, if you look, one of the consequences of the Ukraine war is not the disruption only in this year's food exports from Ukraine and Russia, but in next year and beyond's fertilizer exports. And that is hitting rice production around the world, for example, which is a staple for many billions of people. And, a number of countries are just likely to fall way below their normal levels of rice production. And there's going to be real tightness in the global rice market as a consequence. But,
and we haven't mentioned climate change here as well, which would impact a range of countries from being able to produce what they normally do.
That's absolutely right, Ravi. I mean, climate change is this sort of steady ratcheting up of pressure on countries in that global middle belt, if you like, between the two equators, who, are increasingly suffering from degraded soils, extreme weather events, and so productivity is declining, or at least has plateaued at best in many parts of the world. But it's not that the food crisis is solely around soil, planting, and productivity. It is around this issue of affordability. So, for example, Ghana, in the middle of a debt crisis now, has the most expensive food in Africa. Sri Lanka, ahead of Ghana in the line for a IMF bailout, has, for a middle-income country, now seen the extraordinary situation of more than a quarter of its population are today food insecure. So, the wider economic crisis, which has been created by the war, by COVID, by the trade and sort of other fiscal events of the last decade, have all contributed to, creating this food crisis. So it's not just about grain, water, climate. It's about all those things, plus geopolitics, plus economic breakdown.
So those are the problems and the factors behind this year, where we've seen more people slip into hunger than we have in recent years past. But given all of that, if you were to, from your vantage point, if you were to think through some of the short-term quick solutions and some of the longer-term solutions, what would those be? And let's start with the short term. What do you see as, the easy fixes that the world should look at? And then we'll come to reforms after that.
Well, look, I think one easy fix is to make sure that the Ukraine-Russian grain export deal brokered by Turkey and the United Nations stays in place, because it's actually now moving significant volumes of grain out. But the second thing it's done is take the sort of speculative sort of surge out of the market, where grain traders felt there was future shortage by losing these supplies from global markets. And so we're sort of pricing up future grain transactions. So, this has created some important sort of deflation in the level of food price increases. The second really important thing to get right is the operations of the World Food Programme, the UN agency that deals with humanitarian food shipments, and which is got huge demands on it which it cannot meet, so it's giving it the support it should to meet. But third, it's recognizing that this is ultimately a purchasing power problem, and that you've got to, in that sense, make sure that IMF and other financial resources, are available to countries to allow them to make emergency food imports. I mean, this is a real throwback that we should be dealing with a hunger crisis on this scale across so many parts of the world. It's become fashionable to say hunger was the 20th century's disease, or threat. Obesity is the 21st century's, and while they're in many ways two sides of the same coin and are both about diet and quality of diet, the fact is we've been thrown back into this crisis of a kind we thought we'd exited from as a global community because of these breakdowns. So we need short-term fixes for them. The longer-term fix has obviously got to be, getting to a much more stable global set of economic arrangements where we just don't suffer from this disruption. And secondly, the other part of the longer term fix is adequate investment against climate change to make sure both that there is mitigation where possible from bringing down emissions, but also investment in adapting agricultural systems to a more water scarce, soil poor context in which food is going to have to grow in many cases in the future. So, plenty of long-term investment needs as well as short-term fixes.
That's a really great set of policy recommendations, both for short and long term. And I guess, money came up a couple of times here, A, on the purchasing power side of things, but B, the ability of the world's big multilateral institutions to fund some of these larger initiatives you're describing. And I guess it always comes down to this, why are we failing to mobilize more money?
Well, I think it is, we live in a strange moment where, we've got used to describing crises as the crises of today, the polycrisis, as some have called it, where you've got up to 90 countries, according to the UN, in the grip of this triple crisis at the very least, even if it's not a polycrisis of debt and food and fuel prices, and so we've sort of accepted that there is a close to systemic threat, or at least a threat to a very large number of people in the world from this multi-headed crises that beset us. And yet we still leave our head deep in the sand when it comes to solution, and look and are incrementalist in our search for solutions. So we call it a fundamental crisis, but we still look for a little bit more money here or there, a little topping up of World Bank trust funds, a little bit, 10 million, 100 million there of extra for the World Food Programme. And we're just not scaling our scale of response to the scale of the problem. And, the argument that we can't is wrong. When there is a compelling political reason, we do. So, for example, the extraordinary international solidarity to provide military and humanitarian support to Ukraine in the aftermath of its invasion by Russia shows whether the will of the way. We somehow have to bring home to those we engage with on the political side that this is a systemic crisis of equal risk to life in the short term and to the well-being of and welfare of future generations in the longer term. And we've got to size up our response in the same way. And I am increasingly of the view that the current international financial institutions, World Bank, IMF, simply seem, for whatever reason, not fit for purpose, not able to take the step up and scale up that's needed. So, we may be looking at a new climate finance institution. And even if it ultimately didn't get created, that the risk of threat of one would make the World Bank and others lift their game in order to avert a new competitor, if you like. But we've got to...
And just talk about that a little bit more, if you will. I mean, what's the likelihood of such an initiative actually emerging and then challenging or, forcing the multilateral institutions to do more?
Well, at Sharm el-Sheikh, at the COP27 meeting, there was a call for a loss and damage fund. And, some people's shoulders shrank in despair at yet another fund when the big 100 billion a year existing commitment that we've had for years now is still not met. And I wish, worry that it would further fragment resources. But, behind it lies this, growing, persistent demand to, help adapt to the impact of climate by developing countries. And it's not going to go away. And, Europe was forced in Sharm el-Sheikh to accede to this request because it risked driving a new wedge between the global South and Western donors, and the US reluctantly came on board as well. But signing up to these sort of communique type promises isn't going to be enough anymore. The anger that led to this loss and damage call and the frustration that the 100 billion a year is still not being met, isn't going away. And so I think we're going to see continued pressure for just, moving, as some international officials put it, from billions to trillions in terms of the scaling up of response around climate and around development. The world's in a hurry. It's not that the centuries where the poor were left largely to their own devices and the rest of the world got on with it. That model doesn't work in today's world. The level of integration we have and mutual dependence we have, the shared climate we have, all means that we fix problems together or we all sink together. And so, I think we've just got to build that spirit of urgent solidarity, which frankly has been missing in international affairs, or multilateralism at least, for much too long.
When I left Sharm el-Sheikh now, a month ago, I left with a sense of, we need an all of the above approach. We need to be thinking about adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, decarbonization. Not one of these things are things we cannot be thinking about. And then simultaneously, given what you're describing, we need to be thinking about climate change and the food crisis and ending the war in Ukraine, and inflation and better financing and better supply chains and less wastage. And yes to all of this, right? All of the above. We need all of these things. And I guess where I'm going with this is, on the one hand, it's a realization, as you put it, we need to urgently do all of these things. But is there then also a sense that in trying to do too much, we might fail?
Look, it's first, you're right. There's no single silver bullet. It needs a quiver of arrows or whatever. We've got to take on a range of problems. But I suppose my whole experience in international multilateral leadership is the second half of your question. The cautionary half is absolutely right. You have to sequence things. You have to prioritize things. You need to get wins on the board rather than just splaying out in 100 different directions at once. And so, people have to sort of set themselves, or governments have to set themselves targets and move towards them. And, I think the other bit that is missing is an awful lot of the things you described in that list, Ravi, and a very good list too, are actually primarily things which are going to happen inside the private half of economies rather than the public government half. It will be technology developed partly by R&D and government, I'm sure, but commercialized by the private sector at least, which is going to deliver a lot of these gains around the circular economy, the sharing economy, around the shift to renewable energy, because it'll be in that latter case, ultimately we can see governments just don't have the oomph to get it done through tax and even through different schemes like that they're coming up with to try and cap emissions. It's going to happen because corporates around the world conclude that their best business models are going to be as close to, if not carbon neutral, and that that's going to matter to their different stakeholders, their consumers, their workers. But increasingly with energy, it's prices where they are and transportation prices where they are. Those who don't move to this new green economy are going to find themselves stuck with an old world high cost model, which isn't competitive and doesn't respond to consumer preferences and cultural aspirations anymore. And they also find that the bright young graduates who they want to come work for them are going to go and work for their green competitors instead. So, I think there is going to be a revolution here, but it's going to be as much outside government as inside government. I mean, COP on the one hand shows governments continuing to pay lip service to all of this, but it's also showing the limits of this sort of all government consensus model with no real enforcement powers to driving the climate agenda. The torch on that agenda is, I think, passing to coalitions of the willing, subsets of governments, but in alliance with industry. So you see whole sectors, cement, auto, starting to work together to take emissions out of their supply chains and production processes. And they kind of recognize the compelling commercial case to do that. And governments, in many cases, running along in the wake, holding their coat, and but not even in the forefront, setting the regulatory frames to incentivize and encourage it. We're living in an age where in too many of our countries, government is gridlocked on the sidelines. It's a much longer and wider discussion, but we're just not getting the kind of purposeful government leadership that we need. Now, there are exceptions, and I would point to America, to the US. It's been a disappointment on the international climate agenda, but Biden's legislation has put a large green-linked stimulus into the US domestic economy, and it's caused
this is the Inflation Reduction Act.
But exactly, the Inflation Reduction Act is a big sort of flagship piece of green public investment and leadership.
Indeed. Well, and as you point out, what government can do is fix the incentive structures, which then sort of, changes how the private sector sees things. And then hopefully in that sort of aligning of incentives, we see change. We'll have to leave it there. Mark Malloch-Brown, thank you for joining us. I always learn so much when I speak to you.
Ravi, thank you.
Pleasure.
Up next is our last conversation for today. Earlier this week, Linda Thomas Greenfield, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, joined Ravi Agrawal to share how her experiences as a diplomat have influenced her work on the issue of food security at the United Nations.
Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Good. Thank you, Ravi. I'm really delighted to be here with you.
It is always good to speak with you. And I think in this case specifically, I know you care so much about the issue of food security and everyone having access to food a lot at a personal level. And I guess it's important to maybe just begin with that. Why is this an issue that is so personal to you?
Ravi, I spent 35 years in the Foreign Service, and half of that period focused on humanitarian. And I served in Kenya, working in refugee camps and traveling to Uganda in refugee camps in Goma. I lived and worked in Pakistan, working in refugee camps, and then eventually ended up heading our Refugee and Migration Affairs office in Geneva. And one of the things that resonated with me throughout that period is that food was a major issue to really focus on in terms of humanitarian work. And when I was selected for this job, my team said, what do you want to focus on? What's going to be your signature during your tenure as the UN ambassador? And for me, it immediately became food security. I watched a 2-year-old baby, and she looked like a baby. I didn't realize she was 2. I watched her die from hunger. I visited refugee camps in Kenya where we were providing bulgur wheat to a refugee, and he didn't know how to prepare bulgur wheat. It was all we had available, and we provided it, in really in good faith. But this refugee looked at me and said, I don't know how to eat this. I don't know how to cook this. It would be easier for me to eat sand. And at the time, I was like, this is food, but it was not what they needed. I watched another refugee who we provided a month's worth of food to. We gave him kidney beans, and he divided up his whole ration for 30 days, laid it out, and showed me a handful of beans that was maybe 16 beans, and said, this is my ration for today. So this is really personal for me. And as we have gone through the experience that we've gone through over the past 2 years with the war in Ukraine and the impact that that's had on food insecurity, I have thought about all of those times in the past where I've dealt with this issue. And for me, this is the most important issue that we can address from the humanitarian standpoint right now.
Thank you for sharing those personal stories. I think that's really important, and it frames the rest of this discussion. I should also point out that food security isn't normally the primary remit of a U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. So I thank you for your focus on that
Ravi,
area.
the primary focus is peace and security, and people will not have peace and security if they do not have food security. So I would disagree with you that this is not the primary focus. This is a primary focus for any U.S. Ambassador or any ambassador going forward.
It should be. I agree. I stand corrected. I guess it hasn't always been the case for some of your predecessors.
I understand.
So let me ask you this. I want to push you towards areas where we can think through solutions for the global food crisis, but just very quickly before we do that, what strikes you as the biggest part of the problem? Is it that we have too many people? Is it that we're not making enough food? We're not producing enough? Is it that we're not efficient enough? Is it that we're not very good at supply chain logistics? What strikes you as the biggest part of the problem?
I would say, I will give you the easy answer, all of the above. But truthfully, it is that we need to prioritize food. We need to prioritize food security, whether it's supply chain, it's fertilizer, it's capacity, it's delivery of food to people in need. All of those things come together as a priority to ensure that people have enough to eat. I would argue very strongly that we don't have a shortage of food. We waste food. We just have to figure out how to get food to the people in need, where they need it, and when they need it. And we should always focus on situations where we are seeing people go through food insecurity issues. For example, right now in Somalia is on the verge of a famine. We averted it, but it's still on the edge. we ought to be laser focused on what is happening in Somalia right now, because people who are food insecure also become politically insecure. Their physical security also is at risk if they are not able to get enough food to feed their families. And we know right now 828 million people go to bed hungry every night. That should not be the case in this world today.
That's 820 million people too many. You've written in the past about how you have hopes for the world using technology, for example, to combat food insecurity. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
You know, let me go back to 2004. I always have a story to tell, but in 2004, I was in a program called the Senior Seminar in the State Department, and they took senior officers around the United States to meet American citizens who were making a living. And I had the opportunity to go and live on a farm with a pig farmer in Indiana. And what was so striking to me about that visit, he had this huge combine that had computers on board, and those computers could tell him about forecasts of the weather. He could see all of his fields and areas where there were brown spots and try to figure out what was causing that. He could determine how much fertilizer to deliver, and that was cutting edge in 2004. And now we're in 2022. And technology has advanced significantly since then. We need technology to help local farmers get the fertilizer and use it efficiently so that they're not overusing fertilizer. We need technology to help farmers in Liberia. I saw women farmers using their cell phones where they were able to connect with the market to say, I just picked my tomatoes and they are ready to get to the market. And if you're not here by tomorrow, they'll start rotting. So technology is important to efficiency. Technology is important to production. And I think technology is important to helping people make a living and really advance in this period. And so I think we have to spend more time, more effort in ensuring that we bring technology to the table as we discuss how we address food security issues.
What are the other main tools in the arsenal for you, for the United States, as it looks to take leadership on the issue of global food security?
Well, first and foremost, we are the leader on global food insecurity. We are the leader in providing humanitarian assistance, and we are the leader in providing capacity to countries to address many of these issues. And I think one of the biggest tools that we have available to us is diplomacy. It is being able to use our diplomatic platform to engage countries and bring countries together to talk about how we address this issue. So we were able in May of this year to get over 100 countries to sign on to a roadmap to how we will deal with food security issues in the future. We will have 49 African leaders in Washington, probably already right now. The Leaders Summit starts tomorrow, where we will be talking about how we can work and partner with African countries so that they can address the food security issues that they are facing, because many of those countries are suffering more than any other parts of the world because of the war in Ukraine. So if we use our diplomatic platform, our leadership, I think we can make a difference in the world as we start to address this issue in the future.
On that note, on the issue of U.S. leadership, we haven't talked about the war in Ukraine this year. Give us a sense of how much of a setback the war has represented for food and food security around the world. And then I also want to push you towards explaining a little bit how the Black Sea grain deal and other initiatives have ameliorated some of those disruptions.
Well, first, what we saw immediately as this war started is the impact that it had on the food supply around the world, but particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East, where many of these countries depended upon Ukraine and Russia for significant portions of the wheat that they imported, as well as on oil and energy in those countries. I made a trip to Africa where I visited Uganda, Ghana, and Cabo Verde, talked with leaders about the impact of the war on their country's economy. I met with farmers. I visited a granary in Uganda, met with farmers in Ghana, and all of them understood very, very clearly the impact that this war was having on their ability to continue to produce. One woman farmer in Ghana told me that she was only able to plant 1 acre of her 5 acres because of lack of fertilizer. The price had gone up so significantly, and she knew that this came about as a result of the war in Ukraine. And I gave a keynote speech in Ghana where I talked about the impact of the war and talked about how we might work together to address those issues on the continent of Africa. The Black Sea deal has been a real game changer at this moment because it unlocked hundreds of millions of tons of wheat that was being blocked in the Black Sea. And we really have to commend the UN, particularly the Secretary General, for his relentless efforts to push forward this Black Sea initiative. He worked closely with the government of Turkey. He worked with the government of Ukraine. He worked with the Russian authorities to get them to the table to figure out how to stop this blockage. And so it has made a difference over the course of the past few months to see grain moving through the Black Sea into the marketplace. And we know that the vast majority of this grain is going to Africa, to the Middle East.
You know, I have a broader question. It's obviously important to ensure a global supply chain of fertilizer and of food, but there's also the issue of self-sufficiency, and that's, you know, something that concerns, I think, the poorest countries the most, because when there are disruptions, they're the ones who tend to suffer first and also longest. I'm thinking of countries in Africa, but also parts of South and Southeast Asia, parts of Latin America. What can the world do to not only improve supply chains, but to simultaneously make some of the, you know, the least developed countries on the planet more self-sufficient?
Well, that is part of what we will be doing in our conversations with African leaders over the next 3 days. It's a conversation we've had across the board that these countries actually do have the resources and the capacity to feed themselves. It's about developing that strategy and building on their capacity to do just that. And that's what I talked about in Ghana when I delivered my speech on food insecurity there, that we have to work with countries so that they produce enough food to feed themselves. Africans have the resources. They have the people resources. They have the land. And it's an issue of capacity and an issue of developing a strategy to do that. There are countries that are exporting flowers. Those same countries could grow wheat to produce flour for consumption. And I think all of these countries have come to realize that they can't depend on the global food chain. They're going to have to work together to produce enough food so that they're not somehow disadvantaged when there's a shortage. And I think they have all come to realize that, and they're working together to find a way forward and to find solutions. And we will be addressing that again with African leaders as we have done with other countries around the world.
Last question, when it comes to food security, what is your big priority for 2023 as we look ahead to the new year?
You know, I think I would put those in two buckets. The first is we have to end the war in Ukraine because that is where the impact on the food chain started. And if we're able to end that war, allow Ukrainian farmers to go back to their farms to produce the wheat that they were producing, that will have a huge impact on the global food market. And then secondly, to really dig in deep on capacity, helping countries build build on the resources they have so that they are able to produce the food that they need to survive and maybe even to thrive and to export to other countries. And so we'll be working with countries on how they will develop that capacity over the course of the next year. At the UN Security Council, peace and security, as you noted at the beginning, is what we focus on. But I do believe that peace and security is also about being able to feed people and not have any child, any person go to bed hungry.
The links couldn't be more clear. I wish you all the best in your endeavors in the next year. Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Ravi, and I wish you the best in the new year.
My pleasure. All the best.
Please welcome back to the virtual stage, Susan Sadagova.
Hello again, everybody. Thank you again to all our expert participants today for sharing your insights and the work your organizations are doing to establish a more sustainable food future for the world. We appreciate your time and contribution to today's program. We also want to thank everyone who helped to make this year's Food Summit such a success. A big part of that success, as always, are our partners, without whom this event would not have been possible. Thank you, Chemonics, Open Society Foundation, and the Walton Family Foundation for your support and leadership in this arena. A big thanks, as always, to you, our global audience. If you missed any part of the summit program, full recordings will be available on our event website at foreignpolicy.com/events. As always, you can register to tune into any of our upcoming programs at foreignpolicy.com/events. That's all from Foreign Policy's 2022 Food Plus Summit. We wish you health and happiness this holiday season. Take care and see you in the new year.